Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next in our series of very exciting events that we run for UKDEA members and the wider sector. Today's event is about the role of local authorities in heat networks. This has been a bit of a big event to put on. We've got 16 speakers this morning. We've got lots of different views from all across the sector. So I hope you'll sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea, and listen along with me. So just a little bit about the UKDA. We're a bit of an unusual beast. We're a non-trade, not-for-profit association, although we do have a very large number of commercial members. We were started back in 2010 by 6 founder members, largely from local authorities, hence the reason for being not-for-profit, non-trade. And we're now over 150 members, are growing rapidly, and we represent most of the major district energy schemes in the UK. So the two images on the right-hand side are the split of our membership by sector. So about 50% of our members are those developing or delivering schemes, so energy services companies, contractors, service providers, and the balance being local authorities, local authority ESCOs. And then on the other side, we've got consultants, legal advisors, manufacturers, equipment and system suppliers. The image at the bottom shows how the association works. At the centre, we've got our full members. So the full members are the ones who face the pain of developing district energy schemes on a daily basis. Big ESCOs, local authority ESCOs, etc. And then around those are the very important companies, organisations without whom the sector could not function properly, equipment suppliers, installers, service providers, etc., etc. So if you want to come and join this growing voice, please do so. So what do we offer in terms of member benefits? Well, the first one really is that we offer a collective network of 150 organisations who work collaboratively together, exchanging knowledge and views. And through us, your voice is heard by central government. We have regular, it feels at the moment, almost daily communications with the BEIS Heat Networks team. You'll also receive regular updates about what's going on in the sector, both through policy, regulation and general information. And we largely try and do this through our 50-page monthly journal. So you get a monthly journal which you can look through as a flipbook or download as a PDF each month. There's also an annual conference and an AGM. We'll be having our first in real life event, hopefully in April this year. And then being involved in regular networking events and webinars such as this one. We've run a whole series of very successful webinars over the last couple of years, and this is just an example of one of those. We've also got our feature-packed website where your organisation will be featured, and as well as the library, which contains lots of documents, hundreds of documents, which I'm sure you'll find of use, many of which are not even available anymore. You can get full help and support through member meetings, so meetings with myself as the chairman. You can advertise vacancies in your organisation for free on our jobs board, and if you offer training, then you could take part in our training register. And mainly, it's a network of members working together to assist each other. So have a think about joining if you're not a member. In terms of the training register, just to focus on that because it builds on today's event. So today's event is really a knowledge sharing event. So our training register is very much about knowledge sharing. There's lots of free courses offered by our members. It's about 50 pages, covers 26 UKDEA members. So if you'd like to get some free training, please do look at that. It's on our website, and if you want to put some training in there, then you're very welcome to. If you're a UKDEA member, and if you're not a UKDEA member, then please do consider joining. So turning to today's event, the question that we're here to answer is why are we holding this event? And I think there's two reasons. Reason number one is that the range of roles local authorities can take in heat networks, and it can be often very confusing which one makes sense for your local authority, or if you're an advisor to a local authority, which one should you be advising? And I think there are also some quite polarised views in the sector that either everything should be delivered by the public sector via local authority owned ESCO, so that's one extreme of the continuum, so very deeply involved, very deeply embedded in the delivery of the heat network. The local authority owns it either directly or through an ESCO, and we'll be hearing from some of those case studies today. or a private sector via a concession agreement let by the local authority. So the local authority decides it doesn't want to deliver the scheme, it wants a hands-off approach, it wants the risk, the funding, the delivery through the private sector. Both of those are equally valid. Both of those are perfectly possible for a local authority. There is no wrong or right answer. A lot of it will depend on how the local authority is constituted and its appetite for risk, funding, etc., etc. So this event is therefore a forum to inform delegates of the options, present impartially the pros and cons of each option, and the range of solutions in between. Just before we move on to exactly what we're talking about today, just a little reminder for all local authorities on the call. Sitting at the side of the UKDEA, not connected to at all, but I happen to be the current chairman. We've got the Local Authority Forum for Heat Networks. It's a free forum for members to join, for local authority officers or those who work in the local authority ESCO. If you're not a member already, or you want to check whether you're a member, please contact the secretary at larfan.org.uk. And importantly, for those on the call who have been involved in Larfan up to now, good news, we're just about to go live with the behind the scenes, behind the login page of the website enhancements that are funded by BEIS. Those include LA profiles, so who you are, what you're doing, case studies, so what schemes have you developed, and a forum for questions for members, which will be actively managed, which is what BEIS have funded. And remember that behind the login section has been created so that we can build a virtual knowledge network across all local authorities working in this sector. All the data that you populate, so the image on the right hand side is just an example piece of data for B&D Energy in that case. That's a local authority profile. All data will only be available once you log into the site. It will be safe, it will be secure space for you to exchange views and ideas. So if you're a local authority officer or you work for a local authority energy company, please get involved. Just closing out really with today. So we've got around 200 registered delegates. So we've got a lot of people in the room. We've got people joining all the time. We've got 3 sessions. We've got session 1, this one, which is a welcome and introduction. So myself, followed up by John Saunders from BEIS, Heat Network Director. Section 2 will go on to the options, advantages and disadvantages. We'll be hearing from George Robinson from BEIS, Nathan and Carrie from Bevan, Brittan, and Emma and Michaela from Carbon Trust. And then we'll finish up with case studies of the different options from each end of the spectrum and in between. There's 16 presentations to get through, a lot to get through. So speakers, please keep to time if you can. That would be really helpful. And please ask questions in the question session. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see questions and chat. Questions is you ask a question. Chat is you just want to say hi, hello, just generally chat amongst yourselves. And there'll be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of session 2 and session 3. So please do put your questions in the question section while the speakers are speaking, while they're at the top of your mind, and then we can either put those to the speakers in the Q&A sessions, or they might respond during the event in writing, or if not, we'll get them to respond after the event to your questions. So without further ado, I will now invite John Saunders to come to the stage. John Saunders is the Director of Heat Networks for BEIS, and John will be making a presentation about the Energy Security Bill zoning proposals, sector update, so generally a good sector update. So I will leave and hand over to John. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. As Simon said, I'm John Saunders, Project Director for Heat Networks within BEIS, and I'm really going to talk about, I guess, the changing role of local authorities and the changing size and scale of heat networks to try and kind of set the context for the other fantastic lineup of speakers as we go through today. So I've been within heat networks in BEIS since 2014. So yeah, you can imagine we've seen quite a lot of change over that time. I've kind of characterised it as kind of before 2012, where there were heat networks happening, but local authorities largely were customers, and that was driving certain delivery models that we're going to come on and talk to later on today. But since 2013 and the establishment of the Heat Networks Delivery Unit, government recognised that actually local authorities had a range of different roles that they could play in taking these projects forward. And now we see local authorities as strategic planners, as early stage developers, sometime owners and operators of networks, and increasingly now and in the future as a critical delivery partner to government in our heat network zoning policy and the rollout of it. So I thought I'd, because the zoning policy is probably the least well known, I thought I'd spend a little time talking about what it is and the implications of it here today. Now, broadly speaking, we've had a bit of a paralysis through analysis, both in central government, local government, and in building owners, when thinking about what the right decarbonisation of heat solution is for those different buildings and those different areas. And broadly speaking, heat network zoning tries to cut through that. It tries to use lots of very clever things that happen in modelling, and then lots of clever people with boots on the ground in towns and cities to work out where heat networks are the lowest cost, low carbon solution for decarbonising heat in an area. And it's our main driver for heat network growth in the second half of the decade. So right now, when we talk about heat network zoning, we're talking about a zone drawn on a map somewhere across the largest 200 towns and cities, and that will then enable a whole host of powers to flow down from central government to local government. One of the critical things it does is enables a local authority to establish zoning coordinators, and these zoning coordinators will be responsible for taking the national modelling and then working out whether that makes sense or not in the local area, or actually what needs to change in order for them to feel that a zone would be representative of the needs of the locale. That zoning coordinator is then able to designate that zone, say, right, this is now a heat network zone, it's a thing, and because it's a thing, there are some powers that flow down. And the major power that we think is going to have a big impact is the requirement to connect for a subset of buildings in that zone. And it's the sort of buildings that ordinarily would have called anchor loads when we're developing up smaller projects. Public sector buildings, large non-domestic private sector buildings, new build, and those buildings with communal heating that already exist. And the idea is that if we have a requirement to connect on all of those types of buildings, then actually the risk involved in developing heat networks in those areas will go down, and also the scale will increase. So that's broadly what we're trying to do. We're trying to increase the size and scale of heat networks over the decade. So we're already working with over 30 local authorities on advanced zoning pilots to work out whether this thing works or not. So that's been a really fantastic learning exercise. And of course, we need to take a whole load of powers. And we're doing that through the energy bill, which is currently going through the Lords and will soon be entering the Commons. So this thing is happening, and it's on it's hitting the milestones it needs to. So I thought I'd just give a kind of sense of what does that mean in terms of the changing scale of heat networks. And if there's anyone from Manchester, I've stolen your ones. So these are two projects that we've worked closely with. The top is the Manchester Civic Quarter heat network, which we supported through an early stage heat network investment project grant. And it's a great network. It's probably a bit bigger than this now because there's a phase 2. But you get the idea, 20 million quid, 20 to 30 gigawatt hours a year, a very well thought out and sensible network. And then on the bottom, you've got heat network zoning for the Greater Manchester area, where rather than 20 or 30 buildings, you're talking over 100,000 buildings. Rather than a few kilometres of pipe, you're talking over 2,000 kilometres of pipe. And rather than 20 or 30 million of capital, you might be talking, several hundred million into the billions of pounds required to take advantage of these heat networks across the region. So you can see that the scale of heat networks is changing considerably. And so I think our discussions around the role of central government, local government, and private sector needs to kind of change with the changing scale. And just briefly, how does this fit into the national context? We deliver about 3% of heat through heat networks, and the Committee on Climate Change still talks about us delivering something like 18% of heat through heat networks as part of the cost-effective decarbonisation pathway. And if you kind of back solve that, you're looking at somewhere between 60 to 80 billion pounds of investment, and I think that might be going up a little bit actually already. Let's hope it's not just down to inflation. And so I think from our perspective, we've looked at these numbers and they've got bigger and bigger every year, and thought about frankly the state of public sector finance, and even with all of the appetite in the world for local or central government to pump funding into heat networks, it just doesn't feel like there's enough money to go around. At least not unless there's a decision being taken to invest in these rather than other serious commitments that are required elsewhere. And local government has exactly the same decisions to make there as central government. And so I think it's, again, increasingly important for us to think about what's worked well in the past in terms of that relationship between public and private sector, and how do we find the right models across these geographies and these different scales of networks to enable this growth in the future, to make sure that we've got something fit for purpose at the kind of scale that we need. And so that's actually me done. That's the kind of context for how we see heat networks and why I think this session is so important, because I think it enables us to have that conversation and to think through what those models look like, what they've looked like in the past, and what they might look like in the future.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, John. That was very helpful, very interesting. I thought your Manchester slide was the most interesting because it shows that although the local authorities made a big play for heat networks in Manchester, it's a tiny part of what Greater Manchester combined authorities could deliver, and that's the role either the public or the private sector needs to take in expanding heat networks.
Absolutely agreed.
Yeah, brilliant, excellent stuff. Okay, well, John, great. I'll leave you to sit in the green room pending the Q&A session, and I see George has ably joined the stage, which is fantastic news, and I can see him, and I will leave you go. So here's George Robinson from BEIS to talk about what is the role of local authorities in the heat networks and the various delivery models.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks, John, and thanks everyone for having me. So I'm going to talk a bit around the models that H&DU are actively working on with local authorities, and sort of echoing the published guidance that is on our website, and that I assume these slides will be circulated, and there's a link at the bottom. So these models on the screen are the ones that are kind of in our published guidance, and H&DU funding, as we go into our detailed project development stage or business case preparation, effectively tries to steer a local authority to kind of pose itself questions as to which kind of direction does it think it needs to go in. And I'll go through in summary level what those kind of directions are, and sort of thinking a bit about what John was talking about around sort of how are we going to bring private sector capital into these projects, given the overall kind of public sector, both central plus local government balance sheet is unlikely to be sufficient to meet that 60 to 80 billion type of investment that John was sort of putting on the screen. So I'm going to walk through each of these in turn at a kind of summary level. So the first is the sort of the simplest in some respects from the authority's perspective. A local authority has identified a heat network opportunity within their area, most likely through H&DU feasibility study, and there looks like there's a technically and economically viable opportunity. Potentially the local authority has some form of estate, might be a civic quarter, might be some social housing that's responsible for and is in control of. And in this model, there are several ways you could effectively market it. You could do a soft market engagement with potential developers and just sort of leave them to sort of figure it out. An alternative where you're looking to sort of market, if you like, your heat load would be to do the study, engage with other off-takers, most likely that will need to do some form of public procurement for the purchase of heat. So if they are sort of MOJ buildings, the hospital, your estate, at present, in order to be compliant with public contracting regulations, it is necessary or deemed to be necessary in many instances to do some form of procurement for that heat. So what you might do is actually say pool that heat and look to purchase effectively an energy supply agreement from an ESCO. And your hope as the authority would be, because you've done all that work, pulling together the heat sources, that actually a heat network proposition would be the lowest cost, lowest carbon option, like John was describing in your area. And therefore the outcome is a heat network is developed, but our only control is through our energy supply agreement. So we're one node of many, and so strategic outcomes might be harder to achieve through this model, but less capital at risk. I'm not going to say it's particularly simple, but from an estate's perspective, you're going to have to potentially do some form of procurement of your heat anyway in the current environment. And I very much hope that zoning will start to make that a lot easier, that we don't have to do these quite complex procurements. But as it currently stands, that is one model. So I've said simplicity, but I'm sure in the QA will say just how not simple it is, and easier said than done. The next model is a kind of concession model. And so this is where we're going to have some form of overarching agreement, and we're procuring effectively a concessionaire to deliver certain outcomes in our area. Where it becomes a bit harder is to say, well, what right do we as the authority have to sort of award a concession? And you can start to create arguments. For example, if you've secured a GH&F grant and that's something that you're offering up, if you've got land that you can offer up to the successful concessionaire to site a energy centre, and effectively you are now marketing that as sort of part of the offering, and now they get a concession over that, and they're then going to have a strategic plan to effectively build out a network under the terms of the concession agreement. This is quite a sort of, in principle, quite an attractive model. You've got that long-term strategic control. You can have reserve matters within that concession agreement over things like tariff, to make sure that it can escalate, of course, but on a kind of understood principle, and that it's not just sort of going off the scales. You've got things like minimum service standards that can be enshrined into that in advance of future regulations that we're anticipating, which might bring that forward. You can also do things like have a kind of strategic vision of how the network might expand. So reserve matters over something like a business plan that needs to be agreed on a certain kind of period. Having that kind of structure allows the authority to agree with private sector how to develop a scheme over the long term without necessarily putting public sector capital at risk. There'll be issues around supply of last resort, and that needs to be sort of agreed and understood in advance of kind of zoning, providing that kind of clarity. But nonetheless, in principle, it's a model that sort of makes a lot of sense, to me at least. I think historically some of the challenges have been, what do you do at the end of the concession period? And as you approach the end of the period, what incentives are there for the incumbent concessionaire to invest in the network and ensure that it's treated as an asset in perpetuity? And I think there are models being explored in the country which help address that. And that is that rather than creating these kind of cliff edges, it's more in the event that the concessionaire fails to fulfill its responsibilities under the terms of the concession, that could trigger some form of reprocurement. But in the event that they just continue and operate as expected, then there would be no trigger event for assets to sort of be handed over to the authority. So effectively, the concessionaire is a concession in perpetuity. To me, that makes it sounds initially like, oh my goodness, what are you talking about? You can't do that. But given we don't actually have, we're not giving anything really, and it's hard to sort of exactly say what we have a concession over, other than sort of an upfront grant, potentially something like some land for an energy centre. It could have been developed anyway if they'd been able to secure a GHNF grant. If they'd been able to secure land elsewhere, they could have developed it, and there'd be no arrangement whatsoever. So I think there are arguments to sort of justify why an in perpetuity arrangement makes sense, but I think this is one we could sort of discuss further. I'm just aware of time. I've banded the last lot into kind of one group, but I'm going to talk about them differently. But the reason I've banded them together is if we think about a joint venture ESCO, so we're effectively incorporating some form of special purpose vehicle, we're potentially putting capital in, private sector's putting capital in, and we have shared responsibilities with regards to the procurement of the infrastructure relating to the heat network. Versus a project sponsor at ESCO, which is effectively the private sector incorporates a special purpose vehicle, and they do it all themselves. Sorry, we incorporate sorry, number one was what I just described. So we're incorporating as the local authority our own SPV, procuring the infrastructure in a public contracting regulations or utility contracting regulations compliant manner, versus us as public sector effectively just simply saying, I don't need to incorporate a special purpose vehicle. We are just going to effectively have a direct arrangement between ourselves and some form of infrastructure sort of delivery partner, so a design, build, operate and maintain type contractor. So it's local authority owning those assets rather than via some form of special purpose vehicle. All of these options require effectively the authority to be comfortable to be putting capital at risk to some extent. But option 3, the joint venture ESCO, I think there have been some slightly exciting developments in what the BEIS heat investment vehicle, or Beehive, could potentially offer. And the Beehive model, where effectively we're trying to procure a private sector delivery partner to effectively take responsibility by bringing their expertise to deliver the outcomes that we want relating to kind of the heat network being developed. What we'd be procuring there is effectively the services associated with commercializing a project, which you need to procure. So if you think as you go into commercialization, if you're a local authority, you're going to need to do some form of procurement to get consultants to commercialize that project. An alternative is saying, what if we wanted to get a partner who will commercialize the project and fund it, and we enter into a shareholders agreement with them, but rather than us putting large amounts of capital in, which we might want to, we could negotiate that under Beehive, but we now have the option potentially that we could have something that looks a bit like a golden share. So we get them to commercialize the project. If they're successful in commercializing the project, they will now be able to reap the kind of benefits of the project, but equally take on the risks of the project. But we might, through the shareholders agreement, effectively say, okay, but we do want these things to happen. So we want to manage how the tariff is managed over the long term. So how will it escalate? What's the starting point? What are the principles of that? And that can be formed part of the procurement for that partner through Beehive. You could have things like minimum service standards, like we saw in the concession agreement I was just talking about before, and potentially other areas. Clearly, you don't want to over kind of burden what you're putting into these reserve matters, but it gives I think, quite a neat route to market using an existing dynamic purchasing scheme, or DPS, kind of which is a kind of published procurement route that BEIS has effectively initiated, that then allows you with your procurement team to effectively see your way through from DPD, or detailed project development, through to the project being delivered by the private sector with minimal capital at risk from the public sector. More likely that it's sort of assets in kind that are at risk, so potentially land for an energy centre, to me would be the most obvious kind of contribution from the authority under that structure. So I'm quite excited about the Beehive route to market. I think it can achieve kind of quite good outcomes from an authority's perspective. Engage with the private sector directly and at an appropriate stage. So rather than having to wait until we've done everything and commercialized the project and then engaging with the private sector, where it sort of feels, well, we've done all the work, why are we handing this over? Actually engaging them at a much earlier stage and giving them an opportunity to shape the project whilst achieving outcomes that we set through the procurement of that strategic partner. So we might want sort of a carbon intensity of our network, which is sort of better than the Green Heat Network Fund carbon intensity. We might want a certain sort of number of buildings in a certain area to have been connected. These can be specified within that outcomes-based procurement for that strategic partner. So that's what the joint venture ESCO route to market being pushed by HNDU would currently look like. The project sponsor ESCO and in-house delivery, the procurement there is much more around you are procuring infrastructure. So you'd incorporate your SPV under option 4, or you would simply just be looking to do a public contracting regulations compliant or utilities contracting regulations compliant procurement for a design, build, operate and maintain contractor, or potentially splitting those up into packages that you would manage. That's a much more complex procurement in terms of ensuring the outcomes that you want. So you can still have an outcomes-based procurement for infrastructure. So you could be saying, I want to engage with a DBOM contractor much earlier, a bit like I was describing before. We want these outcomes. You tell us what you think the best solution is. And so rather than sort of taking the project to detailed design, you might effectively market a concept design and then let the design team within the DBOM contract effectively say, well, we think this is the right solution for this locale. We've seen a few projects that went to detailed design, marketed it at a kind of detailed specification level, and then struggled effectively with the contractors to agree exactly what should be done. And once you allow the design kind of arm of the D&B contractor to say, this is what we should be done, it's much harder for that contractor to say, we disagree, because all you've given them effectively is a concept design that you believe to be the right solution, but not a kind of detailed solution. So from an H&DU perspective, in both 4 and 5, we'd be pushing for them to go to market sooner with a concept design rather than a detailed design. Obviously, the challenge with that is because it's concept in nature, your cost estimates are going to be much harder to manage. So you're almost certainly going to be quite wrong in your capex estimates, and so there will then be a kind of exercise of final business case. Are we happy with what the market's come back? I think that I'd be look forward to the discussion to see what other people think on that route to market. But from an H&DU perspective, given we have spent on a number of projects, many hundreds of thousands of pounds getting them to detailed design, only to find that it's either rejected or materially altered with additional cost, pushing us to kind of the position where it feels like going to market at an earlier stage with a concept and getting the preferred bidder to price effectively what their solution is that meets the outcomes that you want would be a much more sensible way to sort of engage with the market and achieve outcomes that you want. I'm a strong advocate for outcomes-based procurement. It just makes a lot of sense. You establish a kind of strong relationship with your contractor. It's an alliance effectively for shared outcomes, and it's more likely to lead to easier dispute resolution because you've got a shared vision that you've established together at an earlier stage. So those are the kind of options. Obviously, I've whistled through it. I was probably speaking a bit too fast, and if so, I'm sorry, but just aware of time. So I will hand to Simon and look forward to the discussion.
George,
Yeah.
you very ably finished 5 minutes early. So you had 20 minutes. We haven't got. So the reason I've come on early is, firstly, Delegates, there's a whole load of you in the room, lots. We've got 90 in the room at the moment. Can you please put any questions in the question session? Because I'm not sure that George has got too many at the moment. So I'll ask you a couple of questions while you're on the screen, George, as we're running 4 minutes earlier. Question number one is, in the HNIP, there was an obligation that if you were going to get a HNIP grant, you had to move from 5 to 4, as I understood it. Is it the same in Green Heat Network Fund, that if you're going to receive a Green Heat Network grant, it's got to be expended through a wholly owned ESCO, or further up, go further up the tree, if you know what I'm saying? The local authority can't spend it themselves?
No. So that was, we really tried to listen to the feedback in the call for evidence and the consultation, and particularly the questions around what could, how could HNIP have been improved upon,
Right.
and there were quite a few comments around the SPV, which always felt like a very, if dare I say it, slightly arbitrary. Like, well, why at that level of capex do we exactly have to incorporate an SPV to deliver this? So it's absent. You'll see that there is no suggestion in GHNF that you have to incorporate an SPV as a local authority to deliver. So you can do option 5 in this on the screen as a local authority. You could do it in-house. There's nothing in GHNF that says you have to incorporate an SPV, and that SPV then procures a D&B or DBOM contractor.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Thanks. And as we've got 3 minutes left in your speaking slot, and I hate to finish people early, can I ask you another question?
Sure.
But I see there are some questions hopefully coming in the questions chat. One of the arguments I hear from local authorities against going out to market early is that if they go out with the detailed design, they get cost certainty. If they go out early with a conceptual design, there's a danger that the cost, they're sort of joined at the hip with the contractor, they've invested time with them, and the costs go up. I just wondered I have no view. I'm not here.
No. I think I said the same. So I mean, that is absolutely what's going to happen. So you will do your procurement on an outcomes base. You'll get in that kind of model. You definitely want to sort of have a structure which allows you to get to a preferred bidder status, which then allows you to work through to detailed design. But importantly, it's their design team that's doing it, which might lead you to a position where either A, it's too expensive and we have to effectively abort and pay them for their design costs, or B, get to a position which we're happy with, but which is more expensive than we anticipated, now needs subsequent approval. The thing is that that outcome can still happen under the detailed design, particularly when you encounter issues that you hadn't envisaged. And you might have to reroute a whole section of the network because of something that you couldn't realistically have anticipated as part of your detailed design, and you'll find then that you're having to go back to members anyway with a sort of turn of the handle on your final business case. So I would say personally that it definitely comes with a risk, but now you've created a partnership with your contractor where suddenly issues will be resolved over a table rather than us waving a contract at them saying, you said it'd be this price, it's fixed or firm, it's firm price, therefore it should have only escalated in line with CPI. How dare you suggest that we'll be paying anything else? You now take that hit. Rather, you say, oh my goodness, there is a cost that we hadn't envisaged once we've taken it to detailed design, if we've got comfortable with that position. But now we might say we've got a kind of pain gain share. That's a more sort of kind of traditional alliance type model. So in the event that we do anticipate or encounter rather cost overruns post kind of REBA 4, now we'll share those, and that will be through agreement. So an alliance model is more likely to have some form of pain gain share mechanism rather than a fixed price or firm price contract where you're more likely to find yourself either winner or loser. And I'm not sure it's a great win, to be honest, for the heat network sector if you as the procuring authority have not had to incur some enormous cost that the contractor now has to bear. Better actually is that we share that cost as a kind of across the two parties by mutual agreement. And I think you're more likely to get into that arrangement through an outcomes-based procurement early doors. But you could, in theory, get there through a detailed specification and go through a kind of partnership type model. I can't remember what option it is under NEC 4, but there are ways to get there anyway if you do a detailed design. But that's just my personal view.
No, that's fine. And I'm not here to say what's right and
Yeah.
wrong. Let's be quite clear. We'll leave local authorities on the call to make up their own mind as to which way
Absolutely.
we're now perfect time. There's a question from Lyall in the chat for you, which we'll pick up under the Q&A session. So, George, thank you very much indeed. That was a really, really, really interesting presentation.
Thanks a lot.
If you don't mind stepping away from the stage, we'll bring you back for Q&A. So, Nathan and Carrie, could we ask you to join the stage? Tom, could you pull up Nathan and Carrie's slides, please? Thanks very much. I'll leave you to do a double act in your own method of choosing, Nathan and Carrie. So over to Nathan and Carrie, will talk about the legal perspective on the risks, issues and considerations in the various delivery models. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you very much to George for running through those delivery models. I'll skip over these slides. So good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Nathan Bradberry, a partner in the energy team at Bevan Brittan, a UK law firm and a specialist in the field of district energy and decarbonisation projects more generally. Don't worry, I'm not going to spend time introducing Bevan Brittan, and some brief snapshots on the slide, and also my contact details and those of my colleague Carrie, who's joining me today, and energy solicitor in my team. So just to borrow George's slide there, it covered a lot of ground in that 20-minute presentation. The most common examples we see in terms of delivery models are probably 2, 3 and 4. But in this presentation, we're aiming to identify a number of contractual risks and points to be aware of when establishing and running a successful heat network. And these items are probably relevant across all delivery models that local authorities should be aware of to varying degrees. So we've divided our presentation into early stage considerations when structuring the relevant heat network, which I'll talk about. And then I'm going to be handing over to Carrie, who's going to cover some of the construction and operational phase considerations. So starting with the early stage considerations and kicking off straight away with exclusivity, which many of you will know is fundamental to most of the heat networks that have been developed to date. That usually means securing a particular, often referred to as a concession area or an exclusivity area. So everyone requiring heat within that area must purchase heat from the network to be established, and that can be a key assumption for the financial model and investors in the project. So there's a degree of certainty over the returns that are likely to be made from that project. And again, this is a kind of concept relevant to all of those delivery models, even if the local authority is not taking the risk of that itself. So how do you ensure exclusivity is established and maintained? A number of key bits of legislation that will need to be navigated through. So property law, landlord and tenant act considerations. I'll come on to an actual example of that. Consumer protection legislation, procurement competition law, specific local authority governance and VIRES considerations, and future heat network regulation and the direction of travel to promote consumer protection. So just to give a flavour of those, a couple of examples of the challenges that can be faced and that we've come across and sought to resolve with our clients over the years. The first one I wanted to mention is Landlord and Tenant Act considerations. So landlords of domestic properties have certain obligations that you must comply with when entering into arrangements that impact upon residents, the tenants. So that includes a requirement to carry out consultation. The relevant bit of legislation is section 20 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, when that landlord is proposing to enter into certain long-term agreements, which commonly will include the ESCO agreements. The outcome of those consultations can't be predetermined, so there's no guarantee that the landlord, the output from that will be the landlord can continue with the proposed ESCO arrangements. There are workarounds over that issue, such as seeking a special dispensation from the Land Tribunal, or in the case of new build developments, what's quite common practice is to try and enter into the ESCO arrangements before the relevant domestic units are sold. Both of those workarounds aren't straightforward, and my caveat there is legal advice should always be sought when considering that. Oh, sorry. Slides have chopped up there. Okay, so second example, still on exclusivity considerations, is property disposal itself. So this concerns where there's an exclusivity deal or contract is made with the owner of a site or a building to secure exclusivity over that site or building, but then that site is sold and the new owner ignores the exclusivity arrangements and puts in place its own heat solution. So in that case, the ESCO might have a right to claim breach of contract. The original owner promised exclusivity and now that's fallen away. But that might not be much use if that owner has limited financial standing. So one way to protect the ESCO and the scheme, the project in that scenario, is to include requirements on the title documents through deed of covenants. And so that requirement to use the heat network attaches to the land and binds future purchasers. Again, as you can imagine, that does need specialist property advice to put in place those arrangements, but it can be important on certain projects to secure the exclusivity arrangement. So moving on to the second consideration on the slide, customer demand risk. This sort of goes hand in hand with exclusivity in many ways. So it's assessing the level of demand for heat on a project and how that feeds into the business case or financial model. That will be critical to the viability of heat network, again, and under any of the delivery models, even if the local authority is not directly taking that risk. So how can that risk over the demand for heat on a project be mitigated? One way of doing that is to put in place demand guarantees where customers guarantee that it will always require a certain profile of heat and pays for heat up to that guaranteed profile, even if it's not needed. It's often referred to as a take or pay. Whilst that's an ideal scenario for an investor in a project, those guarantee arrangements are very rare because they're not very commercially attractive to most customers. The common alternative, and which George in particular touched on there in certain of the local authority delivery models, is to put in place commit its own assets and estates where local authorities might have offices, schools, housing stock, leisure centres that it can commit to the project. And there may be other public sectors or local stakeholders such as hospital or universities. And that's ideal for long-term committed source of heat demand as well. The other source of potential connections may only be available in limited windows. So a third-party developer, for example, might need to make alternative arrangements if the heat network isn't coming online for when it requires the heat. But that's where government policy and local authorities' own planning policy can really help. And John mentioned the heat zoning, for example, enabling local authorities to put in place its own local plans to commit certain areas or buildings to require them to connect to heat networks. I think it will be really important and key for the growth of heat networks. Coming on to the third consideration on the slide, availability and resilience of low carbon supply. Our experience for most local authorities is that promoting decarbonisation is high up the agenda, having declared carbon emergency and quite often having their own strategies and plans to achieve net zero from as early as 2030 onwards. Examples of those low carbon heat sources: energy from waste facilities, water source from marines or mine water, waste heat from effluent treatment plants, waste heat from underground, all really great sources of heat. But one of the key considerations that we've been grappling with and helping clients to overcome is the guaranteed availability of that heat from those low carbon sources. So, for example, where waste heat from an energy from waste plant is being used, what happens if the plant doesn't materialise, if it's not yet built or has years of delay or unplanned shutdown? Who's taking the risk of that? Who's taking the risk, in fact, on the investment in the infrastructure or interconnector pipe from that source of heat to where that heat's needed, if that source of heat doesn't materialise or unexpectedly disappears over the life of the project. So great that there's government subsidy coming in the form of Green Heat Network Fund, and that does fund a significant proportion of that investment risk, but there is still that residual risk that does need to be properly thought about and considered in the early stages of establishing a project and the business case around that. Lastly, touching on local authority objectives and control, we've already talked about one of the key objectives for many local authorities is decarbonisation. Others include addressing fuel poverty, seeking value for money and commercialisation, getting revenues from some of these schemes to support budgets going forward. The choice of delivery model will, of course, be very important in establishing the level of control that a local authority has and how it will deliver some of those objectives. So I'm not going to go into too much details on that, because I know it's an area that the Carbon Trust will be touching on after our presentation. But just to say, the local authority in preparing or designing its involvement in the scheme might want to consider whether it includes provisions in relevant contracts to at least ensure it has some influence over project outcomes and achieving some of those critical success factors that might be relevant to that local authority. So that includes the points that I wanted to cover on the early stage considerations, and I'll now hand over to Carrie, who's going to cover some of the construction and operational phase considerations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nathan. So as Nathan said, turning to the construction and operational phase considerations, just to note, when I'm referring to developers in the delivery models we're looking at, that can include the local authority as a developer. So the way that the different parties choose to look at a number of the issues we see in the construction phase depends on the type of construction contract the local authority chooses to use. We see that standard form construction contracts like JCT, NEC, MF1 are not really designed for the types of issues that come up in heat network construction and operation. So we tend to see very bespoke arrangements or very heavily modified standard form contracts. As well as requiring exclusivity and managing customer demand, which Nathan talked about, all three delivery models that we've chosen to talk about involve the ESCO making assumptions in its financial model about when it can expect to adopt the system and begin receiving its income. So timing for adoption is a really major issue. And the key types of questions that we get asked to consider and look at are: who will take the risk at the various stages of the development? What does that risk cost? And then what forms of contract are you using, and how is the risk allocated across those contracts, which is particularly relevant where the local authority is also the developer. Delay is a massive risk that we commonly encounter across all three delivery models. So what happens if the development is significantly delayed? The ESCO might have invested capex in the fit out, for example, of an energy centre. It's got capital tied up, or it's incurring financing costs. And how is that risk going to be managed? The parties want to agree consequences of delay, any remedies that might be available to the ESCO to compensate it for its losses. And where you have a local authority also acting as a developer, so if it's building, for example, a residential estate that it wants a heat network for, the ESCO will expect to be adopting or providing energy before the first occupier is in the development. So that's before any revenue from customers can be generated by the ESCO. So what happens then if there's a delay? If there's a delay in first purchase or occupation, or if there's a delay between the first purchase and occupation and the last purchase, the ESCO is likely to argue that it should be compensated because it's incumbent on the developer to make sure that the units in the development are sold or occupied. So all of these issues need to be considered, negotiated, and then documented in your contract. Turning to design and build responsibility, that's also something with a longer term element which carries on after the ESCO's adopted the network. Again, it's fundamental to all three of the delivery models that we've identified to talk about. Key questions that we tend to see are: who's going to be responsible for the design and build of the energy infrastructure? Is it all the responsibility of the developer, or is it a mix of the ESCO and the developer taking responsibility? Typically, the developer will at least design and install the secondary network, the tertiary network, and probably the energy centre building or the housing for the energy centre equipment. But the ESCO will want to make sure that the developer work complies with its technical specification so that the system's as efficient as possible, to avoid increased maintenance costs throughout the life of the network and to avoid heat losses. Where the ESCO is taking responsibility for fitting out the energy centre, there's a number of other considerations, such as interface with the developer's works, between the developer's works and the ESCO's works. So the parties will need to agree on things like managing build programmes, rights to open up, what happens if one party causes the other delay or disruption, consequences of that kind of delay. Then when you get to handover, the developer will want to hand over full responsibility to the ESCO as soon as the network's commissioned, including responsibility for the works that the developer has previously carried out. Obviously, the ESCO, on the other hand, will want to be able to recover for defects that arise subsequently as a result of the way that the network was built, and the developer itself will not really want to take that responsibility. So there are various solutions. Some solutions include the developer remaining responsible for any defects up to the expiry of the defects liability period, as you might expect, and then responsibility being handed over using collateral warranties. As we mentioned, timing for adoption is key, because that's when risk generally passes from the local authority to the ESCO, and it's also when the ESCO can start generating its revenue. So key questions we see here are, what are the procedures for risk transfer when you're adopting, and who's paying for what at this point? We tend to see quite a lot of negotiation around procedures for commissioning, testing, inspection, so that the ESCO can ensure that whatever it's adopting has complied with its technical specification. Who will carry out technical inspections? So is it the ESCO itself, or is there going to be an independent certifier? In terms of movements of money, the question will be, is the ESCO expected to pay an adoption payment? So, for example, in a concession arrangement, or where you've got a JV or a project sponsor ESCO, and the ESCO itself is likely to be making significant investment in infrastructure and equipment to connect the site, will the ESCO require the local authority to pay connection charges? So which direction is the money moving in? From the ESCO's perspective, it's probably under a lot of pressure to adopt the network, where people, especially where there are people moving into a development and there's a specified energy on date. From the developer's point of view as well, it'll want to make sure that the ESCO is not unreasonably withholding acceptance of the network, because the developer needs to get its properties filled and revenue coming in. So once you've actually adopted the network and the ESCO is operating it, we move into the operational phase. Again, in the case of a concession and a project sponsor ESCO, at this point, the ESCO is generally commercially incentivized to make a success out of the opportunity that it's been contracted to, and agreements might be relatively light touch at this point, subject to the points that Nathan made about the local authority needing options to be able to protect customers and ensure low carbon supply. But in the case of a JV, the local authority might continue to be actively involved in the heat network throughout the operational phase, and in fact it probably will. As we know, energy suppliers and construction companies are not immune to going insolvent, and there are also a number of legal and moral issues in respect to stakeholders that local authorities want to consider throughout the operational phase. So we tend to see questions around levels of oversight and involvement the local authority might want to continue to have during the operational phase, bearing in mind that the operational phase could be 25 years or more. What obligations the local authority might have, for example, as a supplier of last resort if things go wrong, and what rights does the local authority want and have to intervene. So, for example, if there are customer complaints about the ESCO, but these are directed to the authority. The types of issues that we see, and one of the reasons that these types of agreements for operating heat networks tend to be very bespoke, is where, if the local authority is a procuring party or not, it's crucial that there are requirements to make sure that there's a credible design for the network so that it's operated effectively and efficiently on an ongoing basis. Because even if the local authority is not taking a direct commercial risk, so for example, it's a minority in a JV or it's a concession arrangement, the types of service level agreements that the ESCO signs up to are critical for the local authority. Even if you've let a concession, you have to be aware that that could end at any point, and there's always going to be a need for future proofing, because the arrangements that you put in place at the start might not run for the intended duration of the contract. Authorities tend to need to consider complaints. Stakeholders might feel aggrieved, and the buck ultimately stops with the local authority, where you've got a situation where your heat network customers elect authority members to represent them. So legally and morally, as I mentioned, issues sit with the local authority, and it needs to ask itself to what extent it might legally but also morally be a supplier of last resort. Simon, I'm conscious of running over time. So if the project's poorly designed, built or operated or maintained, ultimately the local authority is going to take the flak for that potentially. So you're going to want to ensure regular reporting and certain controls. Default and termination tend to be things, particularly the end of the life of the contract, that are not actually necessarily looked at in a great deal of detail. And that's something that we feel quite strongly about, and think that even if you're entering into a 25-year concession, you should actually think about what's going to happen at the end of it. So given that I'm running over time, I'm going to hand back to Simon, but we will take questions in the questions box. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Carrie. Much appreciated, and I'm really pleased to see that we're getting some good questions in the question session, which we'll come to after the next session if speakers haven't answered them in the chat already. So now, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Emma and Michaela from the Carbon Trust, who will talk about the different delivery models from their perspective as an organisation advising local authorities. Thanks very much, Emma and Michaela.
Thank you, Simon. Hi, everyone. So I'm Emma Ashcroft. I lead the Heat Networks team at the Carbon Trust, and I'm joined by my colleague Michaela, who leads on our work, particularly around financial modelling. So just to start, we're going to talk a bit about going through each of the models that have been introduced and what are the kind of key factors that might influence decisions on which is most appropriate for your project. And particularly with highlighting some of the financial considerations. Before we go through each one, we just wanted to highlight some of the trends that we've observed, at least in recent years. Firstly, it's already been mentioned, but clearly a significant majority of local authorities in the UK have declared a climate emergency and set a net zero target, not just for their own estate buildings, but for the entire geographic area that they represent. So that is a principal driver today for most local authority-led heat networks that we've been involved in. Clearly, there's this huge ambition to massively scale up and grow heat networks as part of our national net zero target. And we've also seen increased interest from investors, particularly in recent years, with an influx of private sector investment expected and actually necessary to meet the stated goals around the growth of heat networks. We've also seen a big focus on tariffs, particularly at the moment, given the cost of living crisis, and that necessitating an increased focus on affordable heat where possible for domestic customers, particularly where you're looking at connecting to sites that have a high proportion of people in fuel poverty. So projects are often being developed to try to tackle that challenge and at the very least not make things worse, but ideally make things better for people. In terms of the delivery models that we've seen, certainly in recent years, I think local authority-owned ESCOs have been very common for new local authority-led heat networks. But we've seen other examples of all of the models being used, and particularly exciting some recent examples of joint ventures that are really looking to deliver heat networks at scale across cities, including Bristol through the Bristol City Leap Partnership and Newcastle, which we're supporting at the moment. I know Tim's going to talk a bit more about the work happening there later. In terms of funding, again, because we've seen so many local authority-owned ESCO projects, a lot of the funding is using a mixture of grant funding and concessional loans through the likes of Public Works Loan Board, or for projects in London through the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund. Sometimes internal reserves are also used where they're available. A point as well about the regulatory framework. So the forthcoming regulation, zoning, technical assurance scheme and price control, amongst other measures, will protect consumers connected to all heat networks, regardless of the delivery model chosen, and will also serve to support market growth. And so whilst historically some local authorities might have arrived at the conclusion that they'd prefer to have more control in order to have more control over, for example, the heat tariffs, that isn't, as regulation comes in and price control comes in through Ofgem, that will be, I think, considered less of a risk over the next few years, and so will enable a range of different models to be deployed depending on the project and the local authorities' drivers. And then the last point, just about a kind of strategy, I guess, that we've seen quite a bit with local authority-led networks, where there's a staged approach to building networks, starting off with a small cluster, moving towards developing out over phases to scale to cover a large proportion of an area, with the intention that for those projects that have adopted an initial approach of local authority-owned ESCOs, you build out the first phase or phases, de-risk that, and then the intention is to subsequently expand with the help of funding from the private sector through refinancing, for example. And I know quite a few local authorities that are intending to or have already adopted that approach. So just some of the key considerations for local authorities when considering which delivery model to opt for. We've broken it down into 4 main factors to consider. Firstly would be the level of involvement. So does the local authority have the resource, the willingness, the capability to take on the responsibility of developing a heat network? Of course, if there's a need for it, there will always likely be a need for additional skills to be procured through contracts to deliver the heat network. So to an extent you can contract out for those skill sets, but if you're planning to undertake a role where you're very hands-on, you need to have that expertise also in-house, whether you already have it or you bring in new staff members to support the role of managing the project. So that's your appetite for being involved and having the ability to do that is an important factor to consider. The second point would be around investability of the project. So when you look at the heat network project and you analyse look at the financial model and the returns, what do those returns look like, and are they sufficient to entice the private sector? If the answer is no, that might narrow down your options in terms of what delivery models are most suited for the project. Thirdly would be around level of control. So how important is that to the local authority? For example, if a lot of the heat demand on the scheme comes from your own building stock, you might be more inclined to want more control over the network. And then lastly, around risk appetite. So how prepared are you to take on delivery risk? The more involved you are, the more risk you will have to accept. But this is also directly correlated to rewards. So the more involved you are, the more higher rewards you could potentially secure in terms of, for example, financial returns on the investment. So I'll hand to Michaela now to talk through the local authority ownership.
Thanks, Emma. So focusing on the local authority fully owned models. So this is still following the same theme with the 5 models outlined previously. So you've got the 2 options, the in-house delivery and the local authority owned ESCO. Now, both of these models entail the highest level of risk and reward. And this is largely a factor of having such direct involvement. Everything from securing funding, securing customers, procuring contractors, and then providing resource to kind of supervise that throughout operations. But this also means that there's a high level of control over different aspects of the network, including tariffs and contracts, and also future expansion strategy. In these models, the local authority would typically own the assets and, as mentioned, have responsibility for securing any funding. For that reason, as Emma outlined, in these models, you would tend to need to have a higher level of expertise and capability and resource to be able to take this on. And even then, you tend to tender out to a kind of team of consultants that could guide you in terms of the legal aspects, commercial aspects, and then obviously engineering team as well. So you can see in the diagrams just the difference between the two models, with the in-house being the simplest, with the local authority at the center of operations, and in this case the arrows kind of depict the cash flows. But with the local authority owned ESCO, you have that separate ring fence entity that's been set up that is then taking on the heat payments, paying contractors and receiving funding, although that funding can come via the authority as well. As Emma mentioned, we tend to see more of these types of projects, probably in large part because these are the ones that require the external kind of expertise and commercial and financial advisory, but also it's driven by a desire to have more control over tariffs, and also with a local authority owned ESCO, there is some shielding from the risk because the finances are separate in that example. So in terms of some of the financial considerations, so sticking to the local authority owned models, one of the big positives is that if the local authority is the kind of primary funder, that they would generally tend to have a lower required rate of return, which helps to keep costs lower and therefore tariffs. Downside of this is obviously that they're responsible for finding that funding, or if not, securing it externally. And this can include during the operational years where perhaps operational cash flows are not quite positive yet. They may be responsible for injecting cash in those early stages. And then there's also the fact that they will need to ensure that any kind of debt that's taken on is repaid, and they'll have responsibility for that. The good news is that there are a lot of funding schemes out there and concessional lending, a lot of which are targeted at public sector. So the chances of being successful in kind of sourcing funding are quite high. A few points to note in terms of differences between in-house and the ESCO model is that the good thing with an ESCO is that the finances are separate, so they don't appear on the balance sheet of the local authority, so they wouldn't impact any existing kind of debt covenants or increased leverage ratios or anything like that. It also makes it easier because it's carved out and separate in terms of exiting. If the authority wanted to sell their interest in the network, it makes it easier in future to be able to do that. Another thing to bear in mind though is with the ESCO model, generally if lenders are lending directly into the ESCO, they would require guarantees because of that reason of the fact that those finances are ring fence, that provides less protection for them. And for that reason, they would tend to be more expensive in the case of lending directly into an ESCO. But there is the workaround that they could lend to the local authority and then they would on-lend into the SPV. And then, of course, one of the key factors, as mentioned, is the tariffs, and tends to be a driver of wanting flexibility there to be able to, so as not to cause any customer detriment, particularly if there's social housing that's going to be on the network. And then in terms of taxes, if there was an in-house delivery model, local authorities are not chargeable to corporation tax, so they wouldn't have to pay taxes on any profits, whereas an SPV would. But in both cases, they should be business rates exempt, and also VAT should be recoverable on CapEx. I'll hand over now to Emma.
Thank you. So The second area we wanted to highlight would be around third-party ownership. So this is where a third party would operate the network, procure the contracts. In this example, the local authority has limited control over aspects such as the tariffs, future expansion, for example, although there are ways, as has been described already, to try to safeguard some of those objectives within those contracts. In these examples, the local authority isn't significantly exposed to risks associated with funding or construction or operation of the project. And in terms of rewards, financial rewards would be limited to, if you're a customer of the network, potential savings in energy costs, if that's applicable, and also the avoided costs of maintenance and replacement. So the two examples there would be the concession and then the third-party ESCO. I'll start with the third-party ESCO. This would be where the local authority identifies a heat network opportunity, but doesn't want to commercialise it. And so it could offer up its heat to the private sector, potentially pooling its heat demand with other buildings in the area, whether you control multiple buildings or other public sector buildings, for example. You could form an alliance, a partnership, and offer up jointly to the market a solution. That would clearly offer you some bargaining power in terms of the cost of heat, given economies of scale, and you'd enter into an energy services agreement with the private sector for that, the sale of heat. So in this example, you've got low involvement, low control, low level of risk, and in terms of financial rewards, you're not an owner of the network, so wouldn't be taking a return on the investment. In a concession model, you would enter into a concession with a third party, and there are a few ways that you can do this, again, as have been described. For example, you could fund the construction, and then the private sector pays an agreed amount to adopt the assets, or the private sector could fund the construction, and you could become an off-taker and pay per connection under what's known as a contribution model. So in these examples, you've got a bit more control, a bit more ability to influence what happens with the project. You're taking on a bit more risk comparatively to the third-party ESCO, but yeah, you would have a bit more involvement in the delivery of the project. In both of these examples, again, the returns of the project will influence whether this is investable to the private sector. So typically, fully private-led schemes would require higher rate of return than you would see in in-house local authority models, for example. So some of the financial considerations. So in terms of initial funding, you essentially can secure external funding for the delivery of the project through a concession model. And however, the fact that the return on investment criteria is likely to be higher than it would be if you delivered it completely yourself, that could lead to limited higher tariffs as a result of that. But it's very dependent on the project, the density of the project, etc., in terms of what impact that might have on the project returns, and therefore the tariffs needed. Another thing to highlight would be around some of the assets. So with a concession model, the local authority would retain ownership of the assets and therefore liability. If you're funding the concession model through adoption of assets, you'd be responsible for securing that initial funding. And then with expansion, again, there's in a concession model, you have a more ability to influence that than you would do if you were just a pure customer on a private sector ESCO model. And another point would be just around the subsidised funding schemes not always being available to the private sector. I will hand to, sorry, just one more slide, Simon, will be 1 minute. Michaela on joint ventures.
I'll whiz through this one. So essentially, what this is just showing is that while it can be challenging, particularly early stage or small networks, to take on private sector investment in the case of a joint venture ESCO, we've shown here some result of soft market testing with Beehive and how that would potentially increase finance costs and therefore tariffs. What we are suggesting here is that actually it can be a good option a few years into a local authority owned model. Once the proposition has been de-risked somewhat, you can achieve lower kind of hurdle rates in the market. And then you can utilize that private sector cash injection to scale your network.
Cool. Okay, lovely. Have you, Michaela, Emma, are you down? I presume your last slide was just a question slide.
Yes.
Cool, excellent. Tom, do you mind putting the slides down? John, George, Nathan and Carrie, would you mind joining me on the screen for some Q&A, please? And Emma and Michaela, please do stay on the screen. Okay, so we'll just wait for George to join us. Hopefully George can. Hopefully we can accept 6 people on the screen, or 7 or 8. Yes, we can. Excellent stuff. There's Carrie, and hopefully George is still around because there were a few questions for George.
I'm here.
Oh, you are, George. I'm dreadfully sorry.
The other bald guy.
Yes, sorry, George. Apologies. I'll try and whiz through them. So in reverse order from the bottom. So Lyall asked you a question about joint venture ESCO modules, and you said about Beehive. Just a question for me, I suppose, just to help support Lyall. If you are an ESCO and you want to join that framework, is it possible to do that now, or is there a round when you can join that framework?
So yes, that's the beauty of it. The one advantage of the DPS is that it is dynamic. So therefore they can engage with Triple Point, who's our delivery partner for Beehive. Ken's put some details in the chat. Yes, they can. There are various things steps they have to get through, but it's not round based, so they can just get in touch.
Okay, Lyall, I saw you jumped on the stage. I know you're a speaker for later. Did you have a particular question for George?
Yes, sorry, I just took the privilege slightly early, but yeah, thanks for that, George. I think that JV ESCO model, I think we're all in agreement that that's a really effective means to delivering, and just wondering in setup of that and an execution how we support the local authorities in making those decisions about who they want to potentially partner with, and I suppose this is true for the concession model as well, and just wondering if there's a role for other parties to help in that commercialisation phase, because I know from my perspective, having worked for an ESCO in the past, that there's a lot of investment required to get to that point that they would look to invest, and just wondering whether there's an opportunity for consultancies to or otherwise to partner with the local authorities and with the ESCOs as well, and provide that go-between to help get it to the point that the ESCOs are able to invest in. I know that's something that I've heard the ESCOs are keen to do.
Yep.
Thanks, Lyall. We'll need a very quick answer from George.
Quick answer, yeah. The quick answer is yes, there is absolutely a role for consultants to help develop those materials. My hope, though, is that through some work that we're doing with Amberside, who work with Triple Point, is that we will look to try and standardise our kind of route to market through Beehive, so that we don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel on every tender. What we want to do is get to a position where the form of the tender looks very similar for each transaction. It's just the nature of the project is different, but how we're getting people to bid, how we're evaluating those bids is standardized. That's what I hope we move towards in Beehive. So there's a role for consultants, but there's an overarching role on us to make sure we standardize that.
Perfect, lovely, thanks. Okay, Lyall, I'll ask you to step back into the green room. Nathan and Carrie, I see you've decided to answer your question after the event because it's quite a long response, so I'll hold you to that.
Yes, we've got a good response, but it's too long to fit into the box. Right?
No, because I think that's a really important issue. So just for everybody on the call, this is about the procurement bill currently being debated, which we think will change public sector procurement quite a lot. So that's a question asked by George. So we'll move on to John.
We've got some materials that we'll be able to send links to as well, Simon, just to give an overview on some of that as well. Yeah.
Super.
And we're planning some training, which we'll ask Tom to put in your training resource as well.
Cool. I think lots of thumbs up I see coming from the delegates. So lots of delegates very excited about that. John Saunders, you've got a question for Mr. John Sanderson about mandatory connections for individual boilers. I'm not sure that heat network zoning will apply to individual properties with individual boilers. But would you like to clarify, John?
Well, kind of yes and no. We're not going to be mandating individual domestic buildings to connect to a heat network, but all of our kind of assumptions are that at some point in the future, if heat networks are able to run past a whole load of houses and offer good terms, that there'd be an amount of kind of infill of buildings connecting to that network, including individual domestic. But we're not going to mandate individual domestic to replace gas boilers and connecting to a heat network.
Okay, cool. No, that's clear. Thanks very much indeed. Do any of the speakers feel able to take on Joel's question about how you get around take or pay options for mains utility suppliers, i.e. gas? Or should we leave that for somebody to respond to later in the chat?
I thought that's possibly, I guess, to do with the purchase of the fuel itself and the arrangement you've got with the relevant supplier. So yeah, you can attract better rates if you commit to take or pay options. But certainly in electricity context, it's possible to do different types of deals where you're not committed to that, but you'll end up paying potentially higher tariffs. I think that's what the question is getting at. But happy to.
Yeah, just from my perspective to feed in from my thoughts, the one big issue I've seen is where a scheme is starting quite small, but has to procure gas for the full scheme, and the scheme in the early years ends up paying a very high fixed gas cost in order to secure that for the long term, and that can distort the business model. So that is an issue. George, do you feel brave enough to take on Toby Heysham's question about what do you think the Bradford network teaches us, if you actually even know about the Bradford network?
No, I do know about the Bradford network. I have to be a little bit careful, but so for those who are unaware, so it is a scheme that was a private developer effectively identified the opportunity, having identified through our published pipeline that there was an opportunity that had effectively been the authority had stepped away from, and then they explored it independently, looked at it, developed it, and are now building it, having secured a GH&F grant. So I think as a model of private sector sort of spearheading a project that's essentially public sector, both BEIS from an HNIT perspective and the authority effectively walked away from, but now there are pipes are going in the ground. I think it's incredibly exciting, and to me it's a strong message that if we can get the kind of zonal context, if that's the right phrase, right, and sort of the environment right, then we should see more and more of these enterprising kind of disruptors developing networks and forming good relationships with their contractors. So I don't know what more to say other than I'm all for it, and I think it's fantastic.
No, that's fine. No, quite clear. So 3 questions. I'm conscious we've got a couple of minutes. So we've got one from Veronica, heat zoning regards to retrofit. Interested in the view and experience to date from speakers about the level of exclusivity and build-out risk reduction this is expected to provide. So this is open to anybody who wishes to jump in about what they either expect heat zoning to deliver, or from BEIS what you're planning heat network zoning to deliver. So maybe start off with John, who's looking thoughtful, as you did speak about zoning, and then anybody else jump in.
Yeah, well, I think it's too soon to talk about the views of the investment community and the private sector in responding to the zoning policy. But in terms of what we think it's going to do, definitely reducing that connection risk, especially trying to move from the smaller kind of phase 1 networks into something much bigger from the get-go, which we think will then be more attractive to a range of different delivery partners. In terms of the specific routes, I mean, we consulted on kind of broadly three ways that we might kind of designate a zone, and each of those are kind of in our consultation, but the kind of 2 extremes are very similar to how Simon was outlining it right at the start, which is something that looks quite controlled by a local actor, the zoning coordinator, or something that's quite open, which enables private sector to move and take advantage of the powers within the zone. So we're still developing those delivery models, and depending on what they end up looking like, I think it will then determine how investors, developers, and local authorities feel about the kind of risk reward within those zones.
Okay, great. Just while other speakers are thinking, because we're nearly up with questions and answers time, on the regulatory framework, I think I'll just answer that. The smaller communal networks as well as larger district heating networks, I'm presuming there's going to be no differential in terms of being captured in a zone and or off-GEMS heat network policy applying to them. John, is that correct?
Yeah, so communal heating are going to be one of our mandated loads under zoning. And then, yes, in terms of who we're regulating, will be our general authorisation regime is going to be for communal heating and district heating. We imagine that some of the additional stuff, like additional rights and powers, will be managed through a licence regime, and that would likely be the larger heat networks. So that's where it'd be a difference.
Okay. Before we close the Q&A, any other speakers would like to jump in on their thoughts or views on heat network zoning, as it was asked to all speakers? I don't want to restrict you speaking. We've got another minute, most probably. Nope. Okay.
I think they're just glad that I took the question, Simon, and they're staying on mute.
No, that's fabulous. And I'd just like to say a really, really big thanks to all you speakers for keeping to time, responding to the questions. If there's questions in the chat still to be responded to, it'd be great if you could respond to them. So thanks very much indeed. Virtual clap. And if you can now, we'll leave the stage. We'll go on to session 3. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody. So session 3 this morning is a bit of a virtual, I would say, almost like a speed dating session. We're going to be going around the country, hearing from the different people on the different ends of the spectrum, the difference to 1, 2, 3, 4s and 5s. So Gareth, I'm hoping you're in the green room and that you can join us on the stage. And Tom, would you mind putting Gareth's presentation up? I know Gareth's had a few IT issues, so I'll introduce Gareth, where he's hopefully waiting to join or trying to join. Gareth is both the managing director of Cardiff Heat Network, and he's also a local authority officer, as he will explain when he comes on the screen. And brilliant, Gareth's with us. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Gareth. Thanks very much indeed.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Morning, everyone. As Simon said, I'm Gareth Harcombe. I'm managing director of Cardiff Heat Network Limited, but my day job is operational manager for sustainability and energy at Cardiff Council. So if I can, I'm not sure I can control this. There we are. So I was just going to give you a really brief background and a description of our project, just to give you a bit of context, talk about some of the policy drivers that led us to the particular delivery model that we have. Quite a long history for the project as well, which also kind of pointed to the way in which we've interpreted it, and then just some personal, and they are personal perspectives on how it's working so far. Yeah, there you go. Right, so Cardiff Heat Network, what you can see on the screen is a bit tiny, sorry. But we have the heat source is an energy from waste energy reclamation facility in Cardiff Bay. Has about 15 megawatts of peak heat available. And what we're doing at the moment is phase 1, which is the red line that you can see there, is under construction. The black line is a kind of a notional expression of how far the heat available at the energy from waste plant could go. All of the black dots are potential public sector customers, just public sector. I'll come on to the reason for that later. It's because they have similar drivers around carbon change to us. But together they take up about roughly 60% of the heat capacity that could be produced from the energy from waste facility. So we are also talking to private sector connections along the way, but they're going to be unlikely to sign the sorts of long-term contracts that we were after to underpin the initial business case. So phase one, which is the red area, is fully funded, and that's via an HNIP grant and a Welsh Government loan, which probably makes our scheme slightly different to some of the others. We went out to full OG procurement and have a design, build, operate and maintain contractor with Pinnacle Power. And they are working with us and they're on site at the moment, anticipating completion of that first phase, the red one, in early 2024. So next slide, that's just some photos just to show that we really are under construction. So this is the hot water storage tanks arriving at the energy centre site, which is going to be built here, and some of the trenches, and there are some above ground pipes in certain areas, but mostly they're submerged. So in terms of the delivery model, we are an arm's length company, Cardiff Heat Network Limited. It's wholly owned by the City of Cardiff Council, funded, as I said, through national government and Welsh government grants and loans. The sole purpose of that company is to construct and then operate the heat network. And we're doing that via this design, build, operate and maintain contract. So the company doesn't have any employees as such, but we've commissioned Pinnacle Power to do all of that work. So we were incorporated back in February 21, and we're led by a board of directors that has really quite strict delegation in terms of what we can do, which is essentially just to deliver, as I said, to construct and then operate the heat network as in terms of the details that were set out in a cabinet report that approved the scheme. We report back through the council, so the board meets fairly regularly, and we report back through the council anything that's abnormal or out of the remit that we have, goes back via our shareholders representative, which is another director with some knowledge of the scheme but distance from the board of directors, and then that gets debated back through the council for any changes or any amendments beyond the approved setup. So a little bit about the project history and why this became a council project. So originally the heat source, the energy from waste plant, arose out of a collaborative procurement for a solution for our waste. So Welsh Government set a deadline following which there was to be no more waste put to landfill. So a collection of local authorities got together just to procure a solution for that. So we weren't out there trying to get an energy from waste plant. The question was, what can we do with our non-recyclable waste now that it can't go to landfill? And what came back was this energy from waste plant through something called Project Gareth. Long history, it turned out to be quite a controversial planning application, a lot of local objection, pollution and that kind of thing. And at the time, I mean, this was kind of 10 years ago, really, best part of 10 years ago, there were a few real policy hooks or conditions for the delivery of heat network, but there were certainly aspirations for that. So whilst the plant was under construction, the local authority, along with some of the other big players in the city, were approached by the energy from waste plant and a delivery partner to explore interest in us becoming customers of a heat network. So we came together as a group of public sector potential customers, discussed it quite a lot actually, and there were some details about how we might procure this kind of single provider of heat. So a little bit of legal advice that we got then, and the interest kind of developed through that conversation. We recognised the environmental and carbon benefits of it all, and were poised to become customers of the heat network. But after around about 2 years, the offer from the EFW and their partner stalled. We're not quite sure why, but it did, and that kind of was the end of that, really. But having done all of that work and developed that interest, obviously we didn't just want to leave it. So we got, and this was pre-HNDU days, we got a small amount of government funding to investigate the potential for the council to engage and actually lead a project effectively to step into the shoes of the commercial partner that the Energy from Waste plant was speaking to previously. So we did that, and it looked quite positive. And then that followed a series of HNDU funding applications where we slowly developed some feasibility. We looked at a wider city master plan as well. How could this be one of many heat sources in years to come? And that, through various stages, developed an outline business case for council approval. First of all, released more funding to do a final business case, which included the procurement and all of the various articles of association, documentation, grant applications, etc., etc. So quite a long process there, funded by HNDU and supported, I should say, with expertise from the Carbon Trust. So that was really important for us at that stage. That led then to a cabinet decision to proceed. So we accepted the grant and loan, established the arm's length ESCO, Cardiff Heat Network Limited, and signed off the final details of the DBOM procurement. So that was kind of why it's a council project, essentially, I suppose, because the approach from the private sector had stalled all those years ago and didn't look like there was anyone else to step into the shoes. So that's where our interest developed. Just to touch briefly on policy drivers, obviously that, as I've mentioned, this did facilitate the achievement of the Welsh Government's ambition. Welsh Government has set, for those of you who don't know, they've set an ambition for all of the public sector in Wales to be carbon neutral in its operations by 2030. We have this document, One Planet Cardiff, which has a vast array of projects all aiming at that, but the heat network is a key part of that. And Welsh Government themselves have this Prosperity for All, a low carbon Wales, and there's several chapters in that devoted to heat networks. So obviously, a key part of both the local and the national policy guidance there. And we're also interested just fundamentally in kind of local energy security and the circularity of the city's waste heating the city's buildings. So that's why we're pursuing it. Probably also worth mentioning that at the time, the funding from HNDU and HNIP was very much targeted at local authorities as well. So that was obviously in the background. Some statistics there, but the global carbon savings, so they are interesting. And then just a personal perspective on how it works. Obviously, we are able to talk about this signature project. I think it's important to say that Welsh Government's intervention here was really, their funding is almost conditional on this being public sector owned to keep the economic benefit locally. It allows us control over policy drivers, etc. There are obviously favourable funding arrangements. We were able to access funding, and particularly grant funding, that others weren't. We'd already established relationships with some of the anchor partners through the previous attempts. Council is a trusted brand, I think, as well. For there's some scepticism remaining, so that's a benefit for us. And we ourselves we're supplying heat to some of our key buildings, so we're an important and solid anchor customer. Maybe some slight problems, the policy context. I mean, I think it's changing when we're talking about heat zoning, but we've been doing that in the absence of that, and it has been quite a challenge really to convince people that this is a better option than some of the other low carbon options. There is huge complexity here, and we've heard that employing the right experts is fundamental. That there isn't this expertise generally in local authorities, and that's really important to do. The ESCO model, we've chosen that, but I think it was conditional. Some of the grant terms and the loan terms kind of pushed us in that direction anyway. But it is actually quite an unusual role for local authority officers. We're getting used to it, but there are personal liabilities, etc. Some inevitable conflicts of interest. So for example, I tend to give planning advice on planning applications where energy is concerned. But now I have a commercial, potential to gain commercially from that. So I've got to be very careful. And there are some other directors who have have to manage that. It's all doable, but you've just got to be really transparent and manage it carefully. Accounts, all the things that councils do normally have to be done separately now. All doable, but extra work, I suppose. And there's, I suppose that the key message is really stay on top of your director training. The risks are still there, but they are a little bit more complex. That you've heard previously about, ring fencing, some of the risks away from the balance sheet. But that just means procedurally, there's always, you're always a step removed. So there's more complexity there. And one of the things we're just discovering is the agility of expansion funding. So for each new customer, we need to apply for a new loan, and that kind of doesn't fit very simply with the council's own funding allocation processes. So we're working our way through that. All doable, but just an element of complexity. So those are just some personal thoughts.
Okay, well, that's brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Gareth. That's really interesting. For people in the room, I'd like Gareth to carry on over his time, because I thought there were some really interesting points he was making. So it's not all a bed of roses in terms of doing it with the local authority, but the key message, I suppose, is you stepped in because the private sector wasn't doing it. That's the key message, Gareth. Okay, well, thanks very much, Gareth. I'll let you step back into the green room and enjoy some virtual snacks. Please do stay in the online. And we'll now invite Sean Rendall from Thameswey, Chief Operating Officer, to come on stage. So, Tom, if you can pull down Gareth's presentation, and we'll invite Sean to come on the stage. Sean, hopefully you're there. I don't fancy doing your presentation. I'm sure you're hopefully just in the process of coming online. So you just have to press the participate now button, and hopefully we'll have Sean in the room very quickly. So Sean is Chief Operating Officer of one of the oldest local authority ESCOs in the country, and Sean's been involved with the scheme for many years. And excellent, here we have Sean. Without further ado, I will disappear and leave Sean to present. Thank you, Sean.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? I hope you can. Thanks for the introduction, Simon. Yeah, I'm going to squeeze hopefully about 22 years of history into 10 minutes. Thamesway, wholly owned by Woking Borough Council, one of the first local authority owned district heat operators in the UK. Many of you listening today may have already heard what I'm going to say, either from me or from other people. Time to get a coffee if that's the case. If you're working from home, time to let the dog out and put your washing on or whatever else you're doing. So let's see if I can wrap this up in 10 minutes. There are only a few dozen slides. Okay, so what are we all about? Wholly owned by Woking Borough Council, Thamesway Energy, and our subsidiaries, Thamesway, Milton Keynes, Limited, and so on. Set up originally as what's called an energy and environmental services company, Woking being doing its own thing, invented the ESCO rather than an ESCO, double E. We're not just about energy, we do provide some other environmental services as well, and I'll try and pick up on that as I go through. SPVs, all the TLAs here, set up and structured in order to attract joint ventures and partners. We've grown significantly. We still generate our biggest centre of operations in Woking, generate and supply low carbon renewable energy, heat, power and cooling in Woking, and heat and power in Milton Keynes. Turnover 2021, slightly odd year, 10.5 million. Should see a little bit more than that, I suspect, during 2022 as well. Okay, so brief history. As I said, we're a little over 20 years old now, and Woking Borough Council set up Thamesway at the end of last century. Originally structured to JV with, well, actually originally with London Electricity. Excuse me, that's my phone. Perfect timing. London Electricity, hence the Thames part of our name, Wey being the local river in Woking. LE disappeared in Enron, and Enron disappeared altogether. We know what happened there. So after a difficult start, we ended up with a JV with a Danish partner, which was, on reflection, a much better outcome. We were able to bring a great deal of Scandinavian expertise and experience into operating and setting up that first network. 2001, first CHP, a 2.4 megawatt gas CHP site, Woking Town Centre. That grew with incremental addition to the network, and a few years later we were approached by English Partnerships, as it was, Homes and Community Agency as it became, to build something very similar in central Milton Keynes. That became operational in 2006 as a subsidiary of Thameswey Energy Limited. 2011, sort of 10 years on, we bought out our Danish partners. They were heading off into slightly different areas of interest around agricultural AD plants. And we had used that first 10 years to acquire a lot of understanding, a lot of technology, a lot of know-how. And we pretty successfully achieved that buyout to then bring everything in-house. And to this day, the model is still very much on build, operate, maintain. We do as much as we can in-house with obvious limits in terms of special areas of expertise and so on. 2013, we set up a further subsidiary, again, JV, this time with French company Total, to roll out a large rooftop solar program in Woking. And again, we subsequently bought out Total. So we've used these specialist companies or large companies with experience in the sector to launch projects, if you like, very often with the intention of outright purchase and shareholder ownership. 2020, we started our largest project to date, and that's construction of our second energy centre in Woking. The intention that our first one, which is now a little over 20 years old, will be decommissioned in the next 10 years. Second energy centre on the background of these slides at Poole Road. And we had the misfortune to start a £25 million construction project a month before the outset of COVID and lockdown in March 20. But that was completed in just a month or so over programme and energised in, I think it was 13 months to get heat out to support very large development in Woking Town Centre. So we were under real pressure to get the heat on and to get that new customer established and up and running. So that's the history lesson. Why did Woking decide to do all this? Very much environmental policy led. Many similarities to some of the presentations we've already heard and some common aspects with Cardiff. Environmental policy led initiative. Interestingly, for a local authority, a small provincial local authority at that, real appetite for innovation and wanted to leverage technical and commercial experience. Here's the point. This is last century we're talking about. This is 1999, 2000. And there was no established DH market in the UK. There were one or two sites, and Simon, of course, familiar with Southampton, one or two sites operating under different models, but there was no mature market as such. And so the key point for Woking was how did it make progress without support of government or very limited support of government, and even in an area where the legal mandate for local authorities to even operate or own an energy network of any type, the legal mandate for that was unclear, and Woking had to seek council opinion, legal opinion, on whether it was even entitled to do this under local government acts. So in 20 years' time, I'm as impatient as the next person. People who work with me probably believe I'm even more impatient than the next person. But actually, the UK has come a long way, and UK market has come a long way. Local authority engagement has come an incredibly long way, and the role of government and government departments and support for local authorities is transformational and utterly unrecognisable from where we were in 1999. Okay, so ticks the boxes. I think, again, you've heard lots of this already from Carbon Trust and others already this morning. I won't read it out to you, but essentially, I think the Woking model is pretty consistent with much of what you would expect around the benefits and opportunities the local authority was seeking to lever in terms of establishing a DH network. Really important point at the bottom of that, recognition as an early adopter. It's hard going. It is really, really tough to be an early adopter in industry. And I think Woking and Thameswey have been very honest. We've made lots of mistakes, and fortunately, I think we've learned from most of them. Mistakes have still been made in the sector, in Woking and elsewhere, and I think we've still got a long way to go in terms of an industry across the UK to really become as efficient and make the inroads we want to. But anyway, early adoption is hard, but you've got to go through this whether or not there's an established industry. You've got to find a way through it. The downside, I guess, local authorities are patient, but they have limited patience. You've got to have an exit plan. The governance and decision making within local authorities can be slow. I may have already mentioned I'm fairly impatient by nature. Getting decisions made, getting the mandate out in time, operating in a commercially led environment with traditional public sector governance and decision making can be very challenging, and it'll be interesting how Cardiff develop, and comments about training directors absolutely vital. Getting those extensions beyond initial anchor loads, we have succeeded in doing that in both Woking and in Milton Keynes, is tough. Heat zoning will make a difference, of course, but again, these are mechanisms that I think are all designed to help address a real challenge. I think pretty much everything else has been covered already. I'm getting the hurry up from Simon, I suspect. So hopefully it's a case study that's written up on various websites. It's on our website, of course. And if anybody wants to contact me or any of my colleagues, please do. You'll find us in the usual ways. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Sean. I think it was really interesting, A, that you've been around doing this for so long, and B, the way that you've incorporated the private sector, but then almost left them at the wayside to carry on developing yourself. So thanks very much, Sean. If you stick around for the Q&A, that's appreciated. I saw Paul's jumped on the screen, which is excellent. Tom, do you mind dropping down Sean's presentation and putting Paul's up? Just while that's happening, just to introduce, so Paul is the General Manager for B&D Energy Limited, and Paul will be presenting about his scheme in Barking. So over to you, Paul. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, and I promise to get done pretty quickly, Simon. So, hello everybody, I'm Paul Newton from B&D Energy, and I'm going to give you a quick overview of the company and a few comments about how working with the local authority helps. Okay, so B&D Energy, why does it exist? So we were created back in 2016, and the aims for the company were to supply heat and electricity to the locally to residents and companies within the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, and the aim really was to reduce the carbon to meet the borough's carbon requirements. So hopefully everyone in the borough benefits from decarbonisation. Everybody goes together. It fits with the council's objective of not leaving anybody behind. And it was also created as a separate ESCO, so that we were thinking like a commercial company, and we were able to deliver those strategic outcomes, but without burdening the council with too much debt. So just another couple of points. So B&D Energy, we're a wholly owned subsidiary of the London Borough of Barking Dagenham, although we are a subsidiary, so we're separate. We operate 2 networks within the borough. We do everything from generating the heat and generating the electricity right through to supplying people's homes. We do billing, metering, as well as operations and maintenance services. Currently, we employ just 9 people to do that, and we have a long-term growth plan which will leave us with around 10,000 residents within the borough, and quite a few commercial buildings as well that will be supplying heat, hot water and electricity. Keep pressing the wrong button. So the first network was is the one that is fully operational, and this is out in Dagenham. We call it the Becontree network, but that's just a part of Dagenham. It supplies about 170 homes, and then there's a big leisure centre. The big leisure centre is really important because that gives us our keystone contract for constructing the rest, putting the network in, so that we're ready to deliver to other areas that are expected to develop within that location. The energy centre's got a mix of CHP and boilers in it. And And the second network, which is really the big one, but it's in development at the moment, is the Barking Town Centre scheme, where we supply low carbon heat to 8,000 dwellings. Those numbers have gone up since I did this, but that's fine. We've got 2 kilometres of pipework that's been put in now, so that was finished last year, and we've got an energy centre in the what's called the Gascoigne estate, which is a mix of boilers and CHPs, which supplies heat to the number of customers we've got currently. We've also entered into a contract for the building of a strategic energy centre up in the northwest of the borough, which will be a mix of CHPs, boilers and heat pumps to supply low carbon heat to the residents in the borough and also to any companies that are within contact area. So we're very excited by the heat zoning work and being able to add more customers on. And then finally, these are just my own personal comments. So in terms of synergies, working with the local authority, it gives us some critical mass. It gives us access to some support services. That as the ESCO, sometimes that's really good and sometimes it's really bad because we don't quite fit. But generally, I'd say it's good because you've got like an umbrella organisation who are able to help with some of the more specialist stuff. It really helps pull together wider opportunities. So I've mentioned on there heat, solar, EV, but it allows you to talk at planning and a strategic level about those issues, which if you're working in the public sector, it's quite hard to get visibility of everything that's going on. The other advantage is that obviously by being owned by the council, we are working to their objectives. So it just means that we align better with what they're wanting to do in the borough and locally. And finally, I think the big advantage for the local authority is it gives economies of scale at a local level. So you're entering into a market where you're employing local people, you're giving them good trades. The network supplies to local companies, which then gives them the opportunity to take advantage of the expertise that exists within the borough, and it allows everybody in the borough to decarbonise together. So that's quite a brief summary of B&D Energy. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask.
No, I thought that was really good. Thanks very much indeed, Paul. It sort of underlines why, if the local authority is minded to, then there's lots of benefits in creating its own wholly owned ESCO. So thanks very much indeed, Paul. Please do stay around for the Q&A. Thanks very much. I would now invite Toby Heysham to come and speak. Toby, if you pull down Paul's slides, Tom, you'll see a big Toby today because he's bravely decided not to do any slides whatsoever. So Toby will be speaking to us. I would just encourage any delegates to put questions in the questions session. If you're struggling, if you have to, put them in the chat. It's really quite important for the Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Toby Heysham, who's Managing Director of Pinnacle Power, who will give the perspective of somebody who sits in the middle on a particular project of D&B for the Cardiff project and his other thoughts as well. Over to you, Toby.
Thanks, Simon, very much. So sorry for the lack of slides. I've been told to man up and try this, so I'm going to give it a go. So we're a funder, developer, contractor. So we'll do either contracting or we'll fund the network and develop it ourselves. But in the context of this, I think we're really focusing on contracting. We're active on a lot of local authority schemes. Gareth mentioned Cardiff, which is obviously a big one, and I'll try and focus on that. But when we're looking at this, and the sort of title, sort of the longer form title Simon gave me was how to look at local authority ESCO's increasing deployment. Remember that the end goal here is to get a significant percentage of the town connected. So I did a man maths the other day and found that it was in Newcastle. Newcastle has 76,000 homes, and I reckon that's about 1.1 billion quid's worth of investment if you connected all of them. So think about the project from that perspective. Don't think about it through the pioneer network perspective, which is, the 10, 15, 20 million quid thing at the beginning. And how can I get that much investment in the ground is critical. And the way you interact with contractors is absolutely critical. And I suppose, as an aside from that, who interacts with those contractors is really, really important. So, you heard from George and you've heard from various different people today about the different ways we can manage that. I think the big message from me is if you're going to do it and not use a funder developer to do it for you, so George's option 1 or 2, or 3, in fact, really think about the amount of work it takes. I'd be fascinated to know what Gareth says about his workload and how he manages it. But I think it's really hard work, and I know Sean will agree with that. And it involves a lot of contractual nuance. It involves a lot of flexibility, a lot of linking up. And I think having the team available to be quite quick and quite flexible around how it moves is important. My personal view is the easiest way to do it is to have the local authority setting the outcomes. To quote George's, in outcome-based procurement, I want to have decarbonisation, lots of investment, and then whoever's delivering that, the developer. No problem if the local authority is the developer, but equally it can be a funder, it can be a pure developer, and they have that sort of really strong built relationship with that contractor, and allows for that movement to happen. So I thought I'd reference a roundtable we did, which set up by Department of Trade and BEIS together, run by James Beale last week, where we got a load of contractors around at the table and a load of northern local authorities, and I found out what the big problems were, where things can be improved, and unsurprisingly, risk and the resulting price challenge is the big one on that. So if you go for no risk, firstly, I slightly contend whether that actually exists, but then obviously price increases, and that's a barrier, if you ask me. And again, this is my perspective and just mine, for the wider deployment, because there are nuanced ways of managing that risk, and I think that we need to be careful about that. Second one is that the budgets we get, particularly when you do a sort of fixed price contract, often aren't right. And Simon in his other hat is very, we've had this sort of conversation many times. The budget we've got, out of the H&D processes says this, and you've all come back with another price. That puts stress and conflict on quite early doors, and I find that is difficult because it doesn't allow us to be flexible and to be creative about what we do. And I'm aware that the local authority, struggles quite often because there's a grant, there's a loan, there's a budget, it's been signed off, it's been through cabinet, and that flexibility becomes a challenge. Next one is that detailed design. I would wholeheartedly endorse what George said. Does become a serious challenge. The cost certainty is trying to be priced, but it very rarely is. Partly because traffic management comes into play. Traffic management never goes into the detailed design, and the Cardiff team can confirm quite often you have to go a completely different route to the one you planned and have the detailed design for. So linking that, getting the contractor to do the detailed design and the traffic management in one go, which we as a side are doing in Bradford, is really, really helpful. Allows us to make sure we got it all sorted. Everyone's thought about it. If trial holes need to be done, then fine. If there is, in fact, a pain or gain share in place, then that can be thought about at that point. And as a contractor in this instance, I would really endorse that view. All the contractors that model said the NEC4 option C was the option that they would like to use. That involves contract management. So again, to quote Gareth, make sure you have someone who can do contract management. Speed is important, and the speed of decision making and flexibility are really important. So if you're going to do it, make sure you can make decisions quickly, have budget to play with, and are able to be nuanced and flexible. Remember that initial 15 million quid, 20 million quid project is the start. It's not the end. And all the speakers before me have referenced expansions. And that's what we need to think about. I would say a network wants to expand at 10% a year, probably square brackets 10%. And you need to think really carefully about making sure your project's set up to allow for that 10% expansion. So that it's absolutely mission critical. Next one I was going to say is that the best person to take risk is the owner of the network. So if you as the local authority are going to be the owner, that's fine. Take the risk or sub risk packages out, it's no problem. Different contractors have different views on how much risk they'll take. Remember that it'll go up if you sub the risk out, but but I really believe that the right person to take that risk is the owner of the network. There's a central London network, I think, going to happen in a couple of years' time, which is between really the middle of London. And if there is a discussion about putting that risk onto a contractor, the price will go through the roof, and it'll contract the availability of deployment of that network. And I think it'd be a big shame. I've seen prices range from 1.8 grand a meter to 8 grand a meter, which is a big variation, and everyone will have different views on that. And I think we should think about that really carefully as to why that's happening. And I suppose if you're in the middle of London, is where you get to the sort of more expensive bits, have a big think about who wants to be taking that risk. And I think it's a challenging one to think of. Next sort of core point I had from our perspective is that the O&M, quite often you hear the phrase the D-bomb contract. We're largely positive about that. It does definitely stop operators pointing to builders and saying, oh, you didn't build it properly. And typically, if you get a builder who can operate, you get a more operable scheme, in my view. But remember, there's the sort of bog standard servicing and repair of the network, but there's also the optimization of financial performance. So are the returns correct? Are we selling heat? Are we buying utility at the right time? There's a lot more nuance in that second bit of it, and I would be really careful to make sure that is built in and the flexibility is allowed for in that particular instance. The final one I was going to say is that there is very, very few contractors in the market. If you being a bit blunt in the sort of HNIP contracts, which is the local authority owned networks, it's typically, and there is one exception to this, us versus Vital, and I suppose that's not good for the market. I think I have to be accepting of the fact that we need more competition, we need broader competition, and I think everyone taking a view on why that's the case is worth time. Is time well spent. We need to think bigger. We need to think about flexible relationships, and we think about relationships where it is a proper partnership. I think the local authority role is so critical to the development of these networks. Personal view is that it should be a softer role, zone coordinator, planning, cheerleading, leading. I think if it wants to be owned by, as Bristol very successfully have done, Cardiff have done, Woking have done, just picking examples we've had, then be prepared to put the time and effort into it. And I think if you want to make it a big strategic driver, then absolutely terrific. Really, really big supporter of that. If you want just to attract investment and get going, George's options 1 and 2 would be an easier way of doing it. That's my piece. Thank you very much.
Hey, Toby, and I think you successfully managed without slides, and you're getting lots of thumbs up from the hall.
Thank you.
Good. Yeah, sometimes slides without slides works good. So, Toby, if you don't mind dropping away, we'll now go on to 2 final groups of sessions with Lorcan McAlindon, Development Director for Equans Urban Energy, and Tim Rippon from Newcastle City Council, who will do a double act talking about the JV arrangement that is present in Newcastle. So I presume that Tim will join at some point, Lorcan, is that correct?
Yes, I hope so. Can you hear me okay, Simon?
I hear you perfectly. I will hand over to you. Thanks very much indeed, Lorcan.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah, thanks for the introduction, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining today. So, yep, I'm the Development Director for Equans Urban Energy. So I'm conscious we've only got 10 minutes, so I'll try to summarise what's quite a complex private-public partnership. Just in terms of Equans and our presence in the UK, so we are the UK's largest operator of city centre district heating and cooling networks. We've got 12 city centre schemes and have a presence in 8 cities. You may or may not be aware, we were previously part of the NG Group, but a strategic review was carried out a few years ago, and the decision was made to bring together all of the energy and technical services under one business unit. That business unit has since been procured by BEIS, so we now sit within the BEIS UK business unit. But in terms of what we had previously and what we do in the UK today is very similar to previously. So in terms of the sort of core sectors within, we continue to operate in the same sectors. So everything from education, healthcare, defence, obviously now with a renewed focus on technical and energy services. We offer a broad range of capabilities to our customers, so not just limited to district heating, but obviously technical facility services through to net zero solutions. So I think in terms of the number of staff of the 17 NG staff, around 14,000 have transferred across to Equans. So I sit within the urban energy business unit. So that's where our focus is on decentralized energy solutions. So we're around about a 200 strong team when we filled all of our vacancies. So we've got dedicated in-house engineering, design, project management, operational teams, as well as support functions, including finance, legal, procurement, commercial. So with 30 years industry experience, we're quite uniquely placed to offer full turnkey solutions to our customers. So in terms of the Regenerate partnership, so it is a 40-year public-private partnership which was signed in 2018, and the main objective of that partnership was that we would promote the development of high-quality heat networks that will deliver competitive cost, both in terms of upfront capex and ongoing energy charges, reduce carbon across the city, and to drive innovation. The Regenerate partnership enables us to work exclusively with the City Council to invest in and grow heat networks. And in terms of the public bodies who can use the partnership, it's not limited to the Newcastle City Council. We, through the partnership, are able to basically partner with all of the public bodies, from the NHS Trust through to the universities, the Sixth Form College, any registered social housing providers, right through to the emergency services. In terms of the services that the partnership can offer, so again, not limited to district heating and cooling, so we provide a broad range of services from technical FM, hard and soft, through to fabric efficiency projects, as well as solar and heat pump installations. So the first scheme to go live under the partnership is our Newcastle Helix District Heating and Cooling Network. So this is a 40-year concession with an exclusivity boundary, so which requires essentially all new builds within that boundary to connect to the district heating and cooling network. So we've got a pre-agreed suite of commercial contracts, from connection agreement, supply agreement, residential supply agreements. We've got regulated tariffs, connection charges and indexation, as well as a standard sort of service level and KPIs for consistency and transparency across all of our connected customers. So in terms of the capex for the Helix, so it's a £21 million capital project, of which just over 6 million is coming from customer connection charges, which are regulated in terms of £1 per kilowatt of contracted capacity. The scheme build out, it was envisaged a 7-year build program. We're probably looking more like 10 now, and it's probably worth noting that obviously the capex, given the current market that we're seeing in terms of materials uplift, that will probably go up as well. Just under 6 million was provided by ENGIE, 5.5 million from the council, and then the remaining 5.5 came from grants secured through the North East Local Enterprise Partnership and the European Regional Development Fund. In terms of what that has delivered, so we have constructed one decentralized energy centre, which has a total heat output of 10 megawatts. We've also got around 5 megawatts of cooling and an 8 megawatt MVA supply. So it was envisaged when the scheme was commissioned in 2018 that would deliver around 30,000 tonnes of carbon savings compared to conventional heat generation. In terms of the buildings and customers that are connected, so you can see here just a bit of an overview and a scheme plan. So at the minute, we've got 7 buildings connected, 2 of which are actually retrofit connections, which were funded by PSDS, which I'll touch on shortly. So on full build out, there will be around 20 plots connected, and of those, there's around 800 residential units where we will deliver full consumer services to our customers. So that's everything from metering and billing, adoption of the secondary network, and full life cycle replacement. In terms of what we supply to our commercial customers, so it's heating, cooling, and electricity. And I thought it was just worth touching on in terms of how the Helix is structured commercially, because it's quite a complex JV structure. So essentially, it was decided that we would deliver the district energy network through 2 separate legal identities. The first one is Asset Co, which is 60/40 owned between the council and Equans. And then below that sits Supply Co, which is 90% owned by Equans and 10% owned by the council. And essentially Supply Co is responsible for all of the design, the installation, the operational life cycle replacement of both the energy centre, buried network, and the connections into the customer plant rooms. Supply Co can also deliver standalone capital projects outside of the original scope, so such as any of the grant funded connections which we've secured recently. In terms of sort of money flow, it's essentially the Supply Co receives all of the revenues for the availability fees, for the consumption sales, and the electricity export. And then upstream is upstream is a concession payment which is made to Asset Co, which also receives the connection fees. And then essentially Equans Urban Energy Limited receive ongoing dividends and O&M payments. And so in terms of how this is structured, if we develop further schemes with the council through the partnership, we're not limited to this commercial structure, so it is flexible going forward. And just in terms of recent developments, so we secured successfully 2.9 million of PSDS funding, which enabled 2 district heat connections, which were retrofit connections to the Helix. So that consisted around just under a kilometre of buried network, and it increased the peak loads of the Helix by about 1.5 megawatts, and those were commissioned in the second half of last year. Towards the end of last year, we also secured over £1 million of low carbon skills fund, £100,000 of which is currently being used to develop the DH design to extend the Helix from the Discovery Museum down to the Newcastle College cluster, which has quite a high heat load. So it's one of the key sort of strategic growth zones that we hope to connect. And as you can expect, we have submitted quite an ambitious application for the PSDS round 3. We've not yet received any notification as to whether we've been successful, so I'll probably not touch any further on that. I think just sort of to conclude, some of the key challenges that we've seen. So I think first and foremost, as a result of COVID, we've seen quite considerable build-out delays. And I think that has coupled with reduced occupancy, I think in terms of particularly around the commercial buildings, as well as improved fabric efficiencies, as well as the cost of material uplift, has had quite a detrimental impact on the overall profitability of the scheme, both for Equans and the council. And the only way that we can really recover that is through growth outside of the original business plan. I think it's also worth noting that, we are a gas-led scheme. So, with the future planning requirements and the future homes uplift will mean that unless that we can decarbonise at pace, we won't be in a position to offer attractive connection proposals to our customers that will enable them to comply with future planning and building regulations. But however, we currently feel that there's a really favourable planning and policy landscape, which will ensure that we can continue to grow the Helix outside of what was initially envisaged. So I think zoning and sleeving, which Tim is going to touch on later, will play a key role in that. I think coupled with the availability of grant funding ensures that we can continue to invest in new connections and decarb projects, which otherwise wouldn't have been commercially viable as standalone projects. So I think really to conclude, we see the Helix as a key asset within our DH portfolio. And I think through the combination of the enablers, the grant funding, the favourable policy landscape, we can continue to grow the network at pace and really surpass the initial business case expectations. And I think that's it really. I don't know, Tim, have you anything to add on that?
Just really to I think there are a couple more slides after here, Lorcan, to carry on with. So to reflect on some of the things that Lorcan said there, I represent the other side of the partnership. So Lorcan and Equans are on one side in the partnership, and I represent the council, Newcastle City Council, on the other side. Exactly as Lorcan said, on screen here are some of the key challenges. I think one of the other areas that's been a real learning for us has been the absolute importance of diversity of load. We found that in the initial phase of building out the Helix scheme, we've largely been deploying connections to office blocks and maybe some medical sciences facilities as well, or a few medical sciences facilities. What we're finding now is that the diversity of load is becoming absolutely critical, and there's a real need to focus on connecting to residential plots, connecting to the likes of hotels that have a more stable baseline load. That's in order to keep the system running at top efficiency and to make sure the model stacks up going forward. Also, as Lorcan said, there's a real focus from the partnership perspective on using this. I think Toby referenced this in his discussion, and previous speakers have as well. Using this as an acorn to grow an oak tree, really. We like the fact that we've established a helix, we've got a good number of connections already, and we're beginning to have extensions, legs of the network that are moving off to the south and moving to the north and east of the city. But really, our focus here is on continuing to expand that network, but also in parallel, starting to decarbonise it and moving it away from a gas-based CHP system.
Tim, I'm conscious there's a number of slides left in your slide deck, which I think were for you to speak to. Did you want to flash through
Sure.
those?
So to flesh some of those out, this is one of those legs. So the Helix heat station, you can see marked on the bottom left of the screen there. The blue line shows our intended next leg of extension. So some of that's within the Helix development that Lorcan was referencing. But as you can see, extending way off site towards the east and creating a kind of east-west strategic link through the city, and connecting up a major shopping centre, potentially Eldon Square, connecting up to new large-scale non-domestic developments in the east of the city centre around the HMRC building at Pilgrim Place, and then connecting up a range of other connection customers along the way. So this is an attempt to start to expand the network off-site, but also connect up different building types and plots around the city. Can we skip on one, Lorcan? That is the first stage in a wider expansion plan, and this feeds really nicely into the aspiration and the policy intent of heat network zoning. So Newcastle is one of the zoning pilot cities at the moment, and we're really delighted to be in that place, in that position, and learning the lessons of the policy and starting to figure out how it can be successfully implemented. But these southern extensions down towards the college that Lorcan mentioned, but also east and northward connections, are starting to open up larger swathes of the city, which are near the city core and still driven by that density of heat load, but starting to expand into other residential areas and mixed use areas around the city. So we don't see this as being the kind of the end of the story. We want those networks to start creating satellite heat stations and start extending the pipe work out beyond just the next phase of delivery. So really, this is the beginning of a journey for us. Next one, please, Lorcan. So one of the things that we've been looking at quite extensively through the zoning pilot is where our heat load is. And naturally, as with many urban areas, it's centered around the city core. But there are other satellite large heat loads. And we've been doing a lot of mapping, working with government, with BEIS and their consultants to start to figure out where those loads are, which ones are mandatable or would be mandatable under the current consulting terms of the zoning policy, but also which ones aren't mandatable and would be reliant more on discussions and interaction with those building occupants. So there's quite a lot of interest analysis that come out of this. And if we skip forward another slide, please. We're beginning to get a bit of a flavour of what that looks like. So we can break the city up into areas and we can start looking at whether there is particular sense in extending an existing heat network like Helix, or if there is more sense in starting to build out a new heat network. So really the partnership that we've got with Equans is about identifying these opportunities and bringing them to life. So undertaking feasibility work, starting to work up the commercial aspects of a new heat network. So a lot of this is focused on the potential. But what we've done is zoned parts of the city and figured out what the connection capacity is and how we might deploy a scheme there. And I think the final, there's a little bit more focus here on also where our heat sources, low carbon heat sources, are likely to be in the future. But I'll skip on one more, please. So I think in summary, our focus is on continue to expand and improve the efficiency of our existing heat networks, and in tandem starting to decarbonise and move them off gas and displace that gas load with low carbon heat sources. Continue learning from the market. We're really excited by the deep geothermal project that we have, the Net Zero Geordie project, which is a 1.6 kilometre deep borehole and trying to make that a viable proposition for low carbon heat, but also other sources around the city. Proving how we extract low carbon heat from other low carbon heat sources like the river, like mine workings, and air source heat pumps and the like. So moving to new large scale deployment of low carbon heating into heat networks. Deploying our city centre low carbon heat network scheme, which is currently at a techno-economic feasibility stage under the HNDU process. Trialing new technologies and system configurations to improve efficiency and increase the rate of decarbonisation. And finally, prove successfully how a heat network zone can be deployed in a large urban area and start to shift the needle in our transition to net zero on our heat networks. Thank you.
Much indeed, Tim and Lorcan, for a very good double act and for keeping to time. Really interesting. We searched long and hard for somebody who'd actually delivered a JV operational scheme. So it was good that you could come and speak about that. One of the questions we'll be asking, or I will be asking if nobody else has asked it in the question, is you know, the particular reason why a JV arrangement was chosen as opposed to an ESCO delivery model or a concession one. So maybe have a think about that one, Tim, because that would be a really interesting question. So Tom, if you don't mind pulling down the slides on the screen at the moment. Lorcan, Tim, thanks very much. If you don't mind stepping off the stage by just pressing the cross in the top right hand corner of your feed. Super. And I'll hand everybody over to oh, we had some slides there for a second. That's it. So I'll hand you over to Antony Meanwell, Head of Decarbonisation for E.ON City Energy Solutions, and Lyall Archer, who's Heat Decarbonisation Lead for City of London, to talk about the City of London E.ON CityGen scheme and the perspective of concessionaire project. So over to Antony and Lyall.
Thanks, Simon. Can you hear me okay? Good, excellent. So we'll just do some intros first. So as Simon said, I'm Antony Meanwell, Head of Decarbonisation. So that's looking at how we decarbonise the 70 district heat schemes that we have across the UK, but also very much about how we capitalise on heat zoning and how we help grow district heating in the UK from what is the numbers that we've already talked about from John, from 2% to 18%. So really excited about the opportunity that we have over the course of the next 25 years to get to that particular number. Lyall?
Yeah, thanks all for joining for the and staying for the last round of speed dating. I'm sure Antony and I will hopefully deliver something engaging here. I'm Lyall Archer. I'm a principal consultant within Arcadis and lead our heat networks and decarbonisation service line. And one of the key clients or key client areas that we support is local authorities, and we're demonstrating that through delivery of the heat decarbonisation related aspects of the City of London's climate action strategy, and embedded really at the centre of that climate action and emissions reduction strategy is the existing CityGen heating and cooling network, which we've been working very closely with E.ON and Antony to figure out a route for decarbonisation and expansion of that network. So over to Antony to give an overview of the network.
Lyall, are you controlling the slides? Great.
Yes.
Can we go on to the next one, please?
Sure.
So I guess just to give a bit of history, so we're down under the slot to talk about, I guess, a concession agreement. I think Sean mentioned this earlier. So CityGen has been around since, well, it was conceived in the late 80s by the City of London and came into being in the early 90s. So heat networking at that time was not really developed. So there weren't many schemes about. And the City of London really had a vision about what it wanted. So it was very keen, as everybody is, to reduce its CO2, very much wanted to improve air quality, wanted to reduce its operating costs for its heat and its chill, and was very keen to establish a district energy network that could do both heat and chill. Like most, well, I'm going to say like most local authorities, this is probably not strictly true of the City of London, because it it does seem to have a little bit more capital available than most local authorities, but it certainly didn't have the resource within the city to develop its own network, and it was also very reluctant to want to invest its own money in terms of doing that. But what it did have, and we'll talk about this, and Lyall will cover this as we go through the next set of slides, but it certainly had a large load. It certainly had a building that it wanted to utilise for its energy centre. So you can see in the pictures on the slide, there's two pictures at the top. That is the CityGen building. Started off life in the 1890s as a coal-fired power station. So it was that building that they earmarked to be the energy centre. And in addition to that, it was very much wanted to develop this partnership approach as to working with a private sector organisation to develop a heat network. And so it encouraged at the time in the late 80s for Utilicom and British Gas to form a joint venture, for that joint venture to redevelop that old building, which was the power station, into a modern energy centre to provide heat and chill into the City of London, and for that joint venture to do the investment. So, Lyall, if we could just click on to the next one for me, please. So what we have is, you can see the building on the right. That's where most of the plant exists. And today we have an energy centre that delivers about 40 gigawatt hours of heat a year, 40 gigawatt hours of electricity, 10 gigawatt hours of chill, and turns over roughly £10 million. We've just trying to tackle the decarbonisation challenge. We emit 20,000 tonnes of CO2 a year, and we have installed 4 megawatts of heat pumps to work alongside the boilers and the CHPs and the chillers, so we can start that decarbonisation journey, and that will see us, depending on how we run the kit, to reduce our CO2 from between 30 and 50%. And Lyall, if we can click on to the next one, please.
Sure.
So it wasn't really a concession in terms of the way the deal that this was done. So I guess there was a number of different elements to how the deal was set up in the late 80s, early 90s. So we had a lease for the energy centre, which was a 50-year lease. We had a 30-year heat supply agreement. And what overlaid that was a cooperation agreement. So, and that cooperation agreement was just some very high-level principles. You know, we'd pay each other. We'd pay the city for the lease of the pipes and the building. They would pay us for the heat and the chill that they took from us. There was very much clear line of senior stakeholder engagement and cooperation, and then a set of KPIs. And I think, you know, if we were to look at this today as to how might this agreement look like, I think we probably need to cast our mind back to what George Robinson was talking about earlier. This would probably be a beehive. You know, the city would look to utilise the beehive agreement because that would facilitate exactly the way this was done in the late 80s and the early 90s. So I think we'll certainly see lots of opportunities coming out through beehive. Certainly if I know BEIS are working hard to make a few tweaks to that so it can allow us and enable us to do lots of things with it. So really looking forward to seeing how that develops. And that's probably how, if this was being done again between the city and E.ON, how it would be done. Okay, Lyall, over to you.
Sure, thank you. I'm just going to give a quick rundown of four kind of key areas which we see the most benefit from in terms of the City of London being able to support this concessionaire agreement and support CityGen in development and expansion and decarbonisation of the network. So the first of which, as I'm sure we're all aware, is the importance of anchor loads for the viability and commercial viability and support of low cost and effective decarbonised heat for cities. So in the context of the CityGen network, the City of London have 5 key properties which do provide that anchor load to the tune of 50% of the overall heating and cooling load for the network. So as some of you may be aware and have seen before, there's a number of notable sites here. It's Smithfield Market, the Museum of London, Barbican Arts Centre, Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and the Guildhall itself. One of the main benefits of having these anchor loads, again, as I'm sure we're aware, is it allows lower cost of connection for additional properties in the near vicinity. And that's something that we've been really focusing on just in terms of the next slide, which is the network expansion, which we see obviously as vital to the continued growth and reduction of costs and carbon associated or the carbon effectiveness of the network going forward. So there's a couple of areas in which the City of London support here. So first one to note is new connection opportunities in the vicinity of the existing network. So these comprise properties which are owned, operated, or controlled by the City of London itself. And then equally, there are other connection opportunities of other customers that are in that near vicinity that the City of London can incentivise in terms of connection as well. And then if we look at the wider picture, not just in the near vicinity of the network, but in the wider square mile itself, there's obviously additional opportunities and new connection opportunities and buildings which are going through the development stage at the moment. So again, as part of that kind of wider City of London plan for delivery of the climate action strategy, we're looking to develop a common methodology for buildings at development stage, in which we can basically facilitate the means for them to connect to the network in future and in the short term as well. So the key one here is that we work collaboratively with the CityGen development team as representatives from both sides when we're engaging in conversations with future or potential connections. One other benefit that the City of London can provide is in terms of infrastructure and provisions. As we touched on earlier, the development costs for heat networks, especially in the square mile in the City of London, is fairly vast. Connection costs of, we've seen up to £10,000 per metre in the assessment of some cases. So what the City of London can provide and see of great benefit is using the existing infrastructure to reduce those delivery costs. So why trench a pipe in the road when you can sling it to the underside of a car park or through a tunnel? So there's obviously on basements of buildings as well. So there's lots of means that we can facilitate connection of new and existing properties here, and there's other benefits as well in terms of lowering time and maintenance costs. If and when access is needed to these pipes, it's a lot easier to do so in a tunnel or a basement than going into the road again. So that is a big benefit in reducing costs for connections. And just on to the next one. Another benefit, land ownership as well. So the Port of London Authority building in which the CityGen Energy Centre sits at the moment is City of London owned, and that's on a 50-year lease agreement. You can see that extending to 2042, which will tie in with the delivery of the climate action strategy. Again, that reduces capex for potential operators in this concessionaire arrangement, and can provide additional security or surety of a home for the energy centre, which has been the case for a number of years now. There's also the land ownership piece as well. So as the majority landowner in the square mile, the City of London can facilitate if there is space needed for additional plant and equipment. That's something that can be provided, and that's something that we've demonstrated through the resilience support piece. So essentially, there's obviously the primary energy centre, but within some of the connection points, the City of London host backup plants. So, for example, there are top-up boilers in the Guildhall that are used in the case of, if there is downtime required within the Port of London Authority building, and we can use those additional items of plant and equipment to support wider network resilience as well. And just in terms of one of the primary benefits of the City of London as a local authority and a public sector body is obviously access to the wide range of funding, as we see this is going to be hugely important and beneficial and necessary if we're going to decarbonise and expand these networks. And there's a number of studies that the City of London and E.ON have collaboratively applied for through the HNDU. The notable ones are the existing Southern Expansion Study, which is circled in blue on the map there, which essentially assessed options for expansion of the network towards the Thames and options for provision of additional low-carbon heat sources. And that's something that we're going to see is really critical moving forward for the City Gym network and the Square Mile, in that is in a slightly unusual position, and that the Square Mile will be essentially a net exporter of heat as opposed to an importer, largely due to the huge proportion of office cooling systems. So anything that we can do to tie them up and backfeed low carbon heat to that network and as a means to decarbonise will be really important going forward. And that's something that's actually been driven by this local area energy plan for the Square Mile, which is in development at the moment, and we're seeing the outputs of that coming back at the moment. And that will, in tandem with potential heat network zoning advanced pilot, which we're hoping to be involved in, and we're looking to see how we can intersect these various work streams and come up with a robust decarbonisation strategy for not only the network but for the wider Square Mile as well. There's a number of other studies that we're assessing at the moment that are looking at decarbonisation of the network itself as it sits, and then a whole host of operational improvement works across the anchor loads and the other connected sites, which will enable reduction in temperatures in future years, which will obviously be critical to, again, ensuring that those low carbon heat sources can be integrated back into the network. These joint applications for grants we found have been really effective, and it allows us to give opinions from both the local authority and from the operator, the ESCO's perspective, when we're in these conversations with policymakers and BEIS. So we're slightly ahead of time. We've got a fair bit of opportunity for questions here. So please, feel free to come in if you've got anything for Antony or myself.
Cool, excellent. Thanks very much indeed. Tom, if you don't mind putting down the slides, and could I please invite Gareth, Sean, Rendall, Paul Newton, Toby, Lorcan and Tim to come back onto the stage, please, if you don't mind. We'll give them a few seconds to all pop back up. Excellent stuff. We've got most people. Gareth, hopefully you're there. We've got Paul. Gareth, if you're still around, it'd be great if you can join, but if you've left, understand. There's a couple of questions in the questions section already, so I'll refer the Jodie Pittaway one to all speakers in a minute. Tim, a couple of questions for you initially. One, the one that I sort of indicated I'd ask you before you left, which is about why did Newcastle City Council decide to go down the JV route? What was the sort of drivers? And also the one from Silas in the question session about your thoughts on energy efficiency measures when connecting the Helix network onto existing residential buildings, which might run at unfavourable network temperatures, which is also a question I expect we could put to lots of speakers. So Tim, do you want to start with the question about why the JV, why not an LAO DESCO or a just concession, just dump it all out into the private sector?
Sure, thank you, Simon. So I think it's quite simple from our perspective. We didn't want to be alone in this strategic delivery. We wanted an expert partner to be with us and to help with lots of things. One to kind of help us with expertise and understanding what the opportunity is and how to exploit that opportunity. Also to help us with resourcing schemes and financing schemes and taking risk sharing on those schemes in the future. So we wanted to move away from it being an LA local authority driven program to actually being something which had that private public sector participation, and we were co-developing and co-delivering schemes in the future. There are other reasons as well, like the tie-up. I think Toby was referencing the DBOM model, where you've got the tie-up between the operations and the design, and there's a lot of synergy there that makes a lot of sense. We know that heat networks, once they're established, that's not the end of the story. There's lots of fine-tuning, there's lots of tweaking, efficiency improvements, secondary system optimization in the buildings. All of that stuff has to go on in parallel with operating the heat network. So that was the logic for us.
Okay, and a question to yourself, Tim, and anybody else who wants to jump in. I'm sure other speakers will have a view. What about the connecting your network onto older existing buildings which run at higher temperatures? I'm not sure what temperature your network exactly runs at. I can see Sean nodding. He might have some comments and thoughts to come in there. Did you want to kick off, Tim?
Yeah, so we started this off with, let's say, the Helix site. It's mainly new build developments, and they're all operating at a particular temperature regime. that's fine. But as soon as we started going off site, we actually started hitting a few challenges. So the first building we connected off site was something called Discovery Museum or Blandford House. And it's a beautiful old Victorian building, massive building, which had an old coal boiler in the base room, in the basement, in the plant room. That was not a simple connection. We had to change all of the secondary side integration. We had to have new thermal controls for the building. We had to build new fan coil units and not even put it on the primary flow. We had to put it on the return leg of the pipe work to make it more efficient. So we've had lots of work to make sure we A, get the heat supply to the building working in the manner that it should, but also B, reduce how improve the difference in temperature between the flow and return, and make sure that it wasn't returning water that's too hot back to the energy centre. So we spent a lot of time having to fine tune all of that and get it to an optimized configuration.
I think it's probably worth touching as well. Just I think maybe the lesson learned was obviously before we connect any sort of retrofit connections is to ensure that we do a really, really detailed review of the plant room. So essentially pull together a big snagging list of all of the upgrades that would be required to enable the integration, and then obviously having the capital pot available that we can, make all of the modifications required so that we get the return temperatures we need. So I think probably for the next round of PSDS, we've obviously started that work already, just getting those site visits done ahead of time so that we know what to expect when we're actually connecting the buildings.
Yeah, no, indeed. Anybody else want to jump in?
Simon.
Sean, I saw you nodding. I thought you might want to jump in on that one.
I've got the challenge of joining a 20-year-old network that operates at 80 Celsius flow to a 2-year-old network that operates at 60. And interconnection those two networks whilst preserving the live customers, including our local authority owners who are on the old network operating at 80. It's a real challenge and technical piece that needs to be worked out. Two things I'd say. We've taken an easy route, maybe an easy route, I'm not sure it's that easy. We've just going through completing 2 office buildings on the new network, but they're both existing buildings. One's 20 years old, one's 50 years old, 50-year-old office tower block. And we had the choice of refitting the entire secondary units, and they were a mess, frankly, secondary side within those. So we've worked with them as they are, and we've got water source heat pumps taking the 6-degree water and boosting it to gas boiler equivalent to then circulate within the buildings. Come back and here you are. I'll tell you all about it in a year's time if it worked out well. If you don't hear from me again on it, it didn't work out so well. But that's the test we're going through. That's PSDS for phase 1 funding. Really, really interesting technical challenges about getting return temperatures and the BMS interfaces with our SCADA. Wow, that makes your head hurt. But my point is, we're all going to have to do it, especially those guys who are operating older networks or people who are operating newer networks who want to connect older stock. And the choice of refishing the secondary side, the control system, repiping the whole thing, putting huge fan coil units in shallow roof voids and 50-year-old buildings. I mean, the list is endless. We need to learn about this. We need to share experience. We need, I think, the industry. There's something here, Simon, for UKDEA to pick up. This is the new frontier for heat networks. We cannot go on just assuming we're going to build and connect new buildings, phase developments and all the rest of it. To really scale up is how do we deal with this legacy of the old tatty stuff, may I put it that way, and how do we get that onto low temperature networks? And by the way, let's not kill everybody with Legionella. If there's any public health people listening who just freak out the thought of taking 6-degree water into their buildings. So yeah, the challenges are significant, but there's answers there if we can just share them. The thing we must not do is all make the same mistakes. We've got to share this stuff. We can't have people sitting on IP and guarding it jealously.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting feedback. I noticed that Antony Meanwell has responded in the chat. Antony, are you happy you've responded, or did you want to come in the call and just speak a few bits to what you've written?
I probably just want to pick up on Sean's point, actually. So about sharing knowledge and IP. So we have a similar issue with, we've got lots of old buildings from the city on our network, so we have lots of temperature challenges. We've been quite innovative in terms of how we've connected some of the new buildings, especially with the integration of the heat pump that the 4 megawatts of heat pump that we've put in. So we're going to run this year a number of sessions which will be open to everybody to come along and join, because we've learned some wonderful lessons with the installation of our boreholes and heat pumps that I wouldn't want anybody else to make, and I'd like to share that with you. So tad embarrassing, mate, it will be, but let's just make it once rather than everybody making it, because it is vitally important, and there are lots of different ways of doing things, and we should make sure that we are sharing.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Antony. If you can let us know, we'll take that through to members and stakeholders. Does anybody else want to come through on the temperature one, or shall we move on to Jodie's question, which Toby has already responded to with an emphatic yes? So I think this could apply to anybody who's on the panel. So basically, how does the discussion with a potential customer change when you've actually got a real network compared to concept? Does anybody apart from Toby? Well, Toby's view is clearly when it turns to reality, the discussion gets much easier with a potential customer. Does anybody else want to add in thoughts on that at all? Gareth?
Yeah, I mean, in principle, yes. I mean, a lot of the existing customers are wouldn't know that we're in the ground. But I just wanted to make the point about some of the good potential new applications in our network involve quite large redevelopment areas. Probably pushing the conversation on a little bit to zoning, but where a master plan has been granted permission in advance of us being on site, you've kind of got fossilized arrangements that are really hard to unpick. So a run-of-the-mill customer is going to be more enthusiastic when you're in the ground, but that doesn't always follow through to some of the larger developments that you really want to get.
Yeah. Okay. No, interesting point, Gareth. Anybody else want to jump in on this question of Tim? Yep, please. Hi.
Probably taking the question at a site tangent, but we found where we've got big development sites in the city and we're trying to deploy heat networks is where we've got multiple developments, lots of different developments with different developers. It's like herding cats. You have to move. All these developments are moving at different paces. You're trying to develop a heat network scheme that will have connection dates that have some degree of certainty around them. But without the kind of backing of the planning framework to really underpin all of that and make it a requirement to connect to a heat network, you're having to let some developments escape the heat network and go and do its own thing because the timeframes don't match up. There's some real challenges there around having to balance big development sites and when they come online against the program of deploying a heat network.
I think the other challenge as well, just to add, not every developer is an advocate of heat networks. So if the best one in the world, competitive connection charges, we can align with the program, deliver carbon savings. We've had multiple experiences with developers who just prefer to go down the on-site solution, and without a really stringent planning policy to enforce that, it gets very difficult when you've got multiple developments to make a connection viable.
Can I add on one just contentious?
Toby, well, you did say the yes. You might as well expand your yes a bit, Toby.
This is just to sort of spice up the discussion. I think the answer is yes, but I would go a step further and say that connections have arbitrarily a 12-year lifespan on their existing kit, be it heat pump, boilers, or whatever. And so when they want to connect, you have to. I think you have to connect them whether you're ready or not. So if you take that a step further and go on to my decarbonising the entire city, I think that means even if you're 5 years away, you should connect them. And I think, and I don't know if BEIS colleagues are still on, BEIS should give a dispensation to allow you to connect to the gas network, put in substations and take the responsibility so you're ready, and then when you can get your pipe up there and connect to the low carbon network or whichever way, then you can do so, but they have been low carbon for the previous 5 years. I think that's the only way we're going to get rollout at the pace we need.
So can I respond to that, Simon? Because I think he's drawn a really interesting point, and the new developments that we're seeing coming up now are shifting towards putting in electric panel heaters, which means they're not connectable to a future heat network, so they're almost becoming, by conforming with the new building regs, the 2022 uplift, that's actually creating a problem, both in fuel poverty terms, because you're creating a one-to-one, a one coefficient of performance, but it's also creating problem zones for heat network deployment. That's a real problem for us at the moment.
Tim, really interesting, because we've raised this with BEIS and they're searching. They're searching for specific examples of that because
Plenty
it's
of them, Simon.
excellent. I'll be talking to you after the event.
Sure.
I'm conscious we should move on to another question because otherwise we're not responding to Andy or Hens. So Andy's grateful for the importance of building cooling and power networks alongside. Can heat networks compete with building level solutions in electrified heat market? So what's the what do panel members think about the importance of also developing cooling and electricity networks alongside heat networks? And I'm conscious that with the move away from gas-fired CHP, we're seeing heat-only sources, but maybe cooling networks in parallel. What do people think about that?
Can I come in on that one, Simon? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure, Antony. Go ahead.
So we at CityGen we have heating, cooling, and electricity production. So this summer was the first time that we delivered heating and cooling into the city without any gas being burnt, which was a day that I remember because it was actually on my birthday. So that was good. So I think it does play a part. I think that having that flexibility and that storage element helps massively, and we certainly need more storage. But it's another dimension. And I guess I'm still cognizant of the fact that lots of us have spent a lot of money on CHP,
yep.
And we have a long life in some of them. So we've refurbished CityGen 7 years ago. We spent £23 million, and those gas CHPs got at least another 10 years. And we need to be able to integrate them and work together with the heat pumps. Run the heat pumps at the right time and CHPs at the right time, so we can deliver cost-effective low-carbon heat. And we've just got to have that. I think adding cooling into the networks helps with that balance and makes a big difference. As when where I am in the city, where we've got that combination of massive cooling load in the city and lots of heating from a residential in neighbouring boroughs.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I see Sean's got his hand up, so go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, just a quick observation. People have heard me say this before, so I have to keep saying it. I wonder whether the oversizing of heat demand that has plagued our industry by building M&E firms wishing to protect their PI and making it, in some cases, eye-wateringly expensive to get heat to their buildings when they don't need anything like that level of heat demand. I wonder if the same will apply to cooling. Now, here's a thought. Lessons from the summer last year, seeing 40 Celsius plus temperatures in city centres and out in the burbs and in Woking as well. I think actually cooling's got a good prospect and good opportunity, and I'm just thinking to myself, I wonder if we'll see cooling demand undersized in the same way that heating demand has been oversized, and we'll all wish we had bigger district cooling pipes rather than the fact that we've all got these huge district heat pipes for buildings that somehow don't actually all need all that heat, do they? But that's just a philosophical point and a side swipe at M&E engineers who overstate the heat demand on their buildings. But we all know who they are.
I've never heard you sideswipe at M&E engineers before. Sure, no, I'd be lying if I said that. Tim, I noticed you had your hand up. Did you want to come in on this cooling point?
Yeah, kind of reflecting on the bigger scale city perspective on this, so not just existing networks, but future networks. What we found when we're looking at more master plan level strategic interventions is that you cannot just keep extracting heat from the ground or from mine workings indefinitely. Eventually that heat will degrade, and you're on a kind of ticking time bomb at that point. You're just waiting for the point where you exhaust that resource. The only way you can actually make that a viable resource is by recharging the ground or by recharging an aquifer or recharging a mine working. The point being that without big cooling loads and integrating those into heat networks, strategic heat networks, it's very, very difficult to make some of these low carbon resources stack up in the long term.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I think that's a really important point. I don't see anybody else waving at me, so we'll move on to Hen's question. Bit of a tricky one, but it goes back to, John made it very clear that the concept of mandating individual domestic gas boiler, individual homes wasn't going to be what Heat Network only would be doing. But Hen's asked whether any of the panel have got views about connecting Victorian terraces, which we converted to flats and have limited opportunities for individual heat pumps, source heat pumps, and whether anybody's looked at that kind of thing at all in any of their networks, or whether it's a to be done in the future type piece of work. Toby, I see you. Oh, Paul, yes, no, you haven't spoken. Brilliant, excellent. Go for it, Paul. Oh, you're on mute, Paul. Sorry, I think you've muted yourself accidentally.
Yeah, probably. My dog was making quite a lot of noise earlier. I think the big one there is if you're going to supply it at a good price, those Victorian houses would need completely stripping out and refitting, and it's the cost, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's definitely the cost for air source heat pumps. Whether it can be done more viably from a higher temperature heat network is the question, I suppose. Toby, you've said yes. It's a big challenge. Did you want to elaborate on your response, Toby?
Yeah, sure. So the way I would look at this, and I have to say I look at the wider heat network business the same, is that it needs to be looked at like fibre. So how can we do rollout at real scale? And the way I would look at it is by using the Virgin model. You know, you type in your house address and they say, we'll be there when we're ready, sort of thing. If you can get enough people who want to do it, it's worth doing. Jim Gillen at Gateshead's looking at this actively now and planning to do this now, and I think he would be the right person to really comment on it. But we have assumed this will happen at scale from the 2030s onwards, and we've worked out the price can work if you've got people who want that air source heat pump counterfactual. We can deal with the temperature thing, to use Paul's point, and it should be done. Should be cheaper for consumers, but it relies on them wanting to decarbonise. Now, were we to get support for the low carbon heat price competing against high carbon heat price, I think we would have a much more compelling case.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks very much. Anybody else would like to make any closing remarks? Antony, please.
Yeah. So as Toby said, Jim hopefully is going to lead the way on this in Gateshead. I know he wants to do about 10,000 homes. We're certainly looking in Sheffield at doing similar, another 10,000 social homes, and trying to do a piece of work that looks at, this is what heat network costs versus the counterfactual of air source heat pumps, the upgrade of the insulation that's required, and the electricity grid upgrade that is required. I know we're all focused on doing the large commercial and using that to help massively grow the heat networks in the short term, but we do have to tackle resi, and we certainly have to tackle the social homes, help those on fuel poverty, and it's a big nut to crack, but it's certainly one that we see as something that we should start to progress, because it is going to take some time to do those retrofits.
Yeah, completely agree. I'll invite any speakers who'd like to make any closing remarks, thoughts, comments, things they wish they'd said in their presentation to wave a hand if they'd like to say anything. Just thinking about that. Sorry, I've got you, Lyall. Anybody else would as well. I think this has been a brilliant event because it's allowed people from the opposite end of the spectrum to come onto one stage and talk together in a non-adversarial manner. And I think it demonstrates there's no wrong or right answer. There's just an answer that fits that particular local authority area. So Lyall, I clocked your hand up. Did you want to make any closing remarks?
Thanks. Yeah, just touching on the earlier point of incentivizing new connections in the world of counterfactual air source heat pump options. This from a carbon perspective, this is only going to get more difficult over time as the electricity grid decarbonizes, and that with long-term or longer-term development opportunities for the heat networks themselves, that problem is going to get exacerbated. I think what we need to do in the kind of shorter term is do everything we can to ensure confidence in potential connections that there's going to be a heat network to connect to in future, but equally that heat network is going to have a carbon factor that is competitive with the air source manufacturer or whatever kind of work at that point. And two things we think critical on that is developing a heat network decarbonisation plan so that we can put that in front of the potential customer and say, look, here's what we're going to do. But then also, I think with the impacts of zoning coming in, having a real clear statement on this is what it will look like, what a mandated connection may look like. Putting that in front of the customer with a decarbonisation plan gives you the surety of the connection will come, and then there's also the carbon piece to that as well. So I think we need to think carefully about how we tie these things up together.
Yeah, cool. No, absolutely indeed. I've clocked Gareth, then Tim, then Toby wanted to make some final comments. So Gareth.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I just wanted to stitch together a few things that we talked about and look at how this is promoted maybe at government level. So We've heard that increasingly heat networks aren't maybe going to be able to provide electric. As the electric grid gets decarbonised, Tim has said, a lot of developers are just planning for electric heat panels, which makes retrofit really difficult. But I think one of the points that's maybe been missed at the top level is, to electrify all of that, to electrify all of heating, all of vehicle transportation, all of this growing demand for cooling, where there just isn't enough electricity left, right? So where there is an opportunity for a heat network, it's a really golden opportunity, and I don't think policy currently reflects that. Why a heat network rather than any of the others? There's obviously some really high level stuff that I'm not sure that the policy or the guidance is capturing. And no matter what you do with planning, you can never insist and enforce one. That there's always a test of viability, and there's always scope to lose an argument. Planning isn't like that. Planning just doesn't say you will connect or you will get lost. That's not how it works. So you've got to have every strand of policy to say why it's a good idea. And heat networks take pressure off the electricity networks for others who don't have access to a heat network to carry on.
Yeah, no, completely agree. Absolutely. Thanks very much indeed. So we'll close with Tim and Toby. So Tim, final thoughts?
Just to echo what Gareth said, he said it really well there. I do think that heat networks can have a really fundamental role in the future to avoid us toppling the grid, the electricity grid. I think they are going to play a really fundamental role. And I guess my reflection here is, once you've got a heat network, it's an awful lot easier to work with the existing asset and expand it and decarbonise it than it is to build one from scratch. So getting out the starting blocks, getting the first acorn established and starting to grow your oak is really important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Toby, final words to you before I close the event.
Thank you. I suppose I just wanted to reflect on that you're right, that there's no right answer, and that's been really well proved today. The point I was keen to make is that if I was in the local authority shoes, I would be asking myself, what do I want to achieve? Is it decarbonisation? Is it inward investment? Is it control? Is it financial return? And I would make a decision based on that. And I think there are lots and lots of different models available, but there's private sector capital in the billions and billions and billions trying to get in here. And if you as a local authority want to drive and control and lead these things, then you should do it. You're the perfect person to do it. If you don't, just want to attract it, then there are loads of ways of sitting back and not doing it. And I think that debate hasn't been very fully had. And I think this event has really shown that it can be had, and I think there's lots of opportunities to do that.
Brilliant. Okay, no, thanks very much indeed, Toby. A big thanks to the speakers on the screen and all those who spoke earlier today. That closing remarks, I think, which is really important. There is no wrong or right answer. It's just whatever works for you as a local authority. So thank you to those speakers today, and I'll ask Tom to bring the event to a close. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.